Tonight, we're diving into the complete lore of Vhagar. There is a lot to explore here, but I'll keep the pacing gentle so you can still settle in and fall asleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. Imagine, if you will, a shadow so vast that it does not merely block the sun, but seems to swallow the very light of the world. Imagine a sound, not just a roar, but a deep, rhythmic thrumming that vibrates in the marrow of your bones. A sound that feels like the grinding of tectonic plates, or the slow, heavy breathing of the earth itself. This is the presence of Vhagar, the hoary old bitch, the queen of all dragons, and the last living testament to a world that burned away long before the histories we know were even written. To understand Vhagar is to understand the heartbeat of the Targaryen dynasty. She was there at the beginning, when the smoke of old Valyria was still a fresh memory, and she was there at the end, when the dragons finally tore themselves apart in a dance of fire and blood. For over 180 years, she soared over the Seven Kingdoms, her scales growing thicker and more weathered with every passing decade, her fire turning from a bright, searing orange to a deep, roaring gold. She was a creature of war, named after a god of the Valyrian pantheon, and she carried the weight of that name with a terrifying grace. When we look at the history of Westeros, we often focus on the kings and queens, the lords and the knights, the betrayals and the alliances. But beneath all of that, moving through the clouds like a mountain made of muscle and scale, was Vhagar. She was the constant. She was the ultimate deterrent. She was the weapon that forged a nation, and the monster that nearly broke it. Think of the sheer scale of her existence. When she hatched on Dragonstone, the world was a different place. The century of blood was still raging across the narrow sea, and the Targaryens were merely a minor house of dragon lords who had fled the doom. Vhagar was the smallest of the 3 dragons that would eventually cross the sea to conquer a continent. Yet even in her youth, she was a force of nature. By the time of the Dance of the Dragons, she had grown so large that no dragon pit could hold her. She slept in the open, beneath the stars, her body a landscape of bronze and jade green, a living monument to a lost age. She had outlived her siblings, Balerion the Black Dread and Meraxes the Golden-Eyed. She had outlived the conquerors who first took her to the skies. She had seen generations of Targaryens rise and fall, and through it all, she remained, a silent, soaring witness to the vanity of men. But what does it mean for a creature to live that long? What goes through the mind of a dragon who has known 4 different riders, each with their own ambitions, their own fears, and their own cruelties? Visenya, the warrior queen with a heart of Valyrian steel. Baelon the Brave, who struck the Black Dread on the snout just for the sport of it. Lady of Driftmark, the girl who loved the wind and the sea. And finally, Aemond One-Eye, the prince fueled by a cold, burning rage. Vhagar was the thread that connected them all, a bridge across time that spanned from the birth of a kingdom to its most desperate hour. There is a mystery in the bond between a dragon and its rider, a connection that goes beyond simple command. It is a merging of spirits, a shared will that can sometimes blur the lines between human intent and animal instinct. When Vhagar unleashed her fire, was it always because her rider commanded it, or was there something older and more primal at work? We saw it at Shipbreaker Bay, a moment that changed the course of history, where the ancient beast seemed to act on a whim that even her rider could not control. It reminds us that for all their power, the Targaryens were playing with a force that was never truly theirs to master. They were merely passengers on the back of a god. Tonight, we are going to trace the path of that smoking vents of Dragonstone to the burning fields of the Reach. We will fly with her over the mountains of the moon and across the salty waves of Shipbreaker Bay. We will explore the lives of the 4 people who claimed her, the battles that defined her, and the tragic end that awaited her in the waters of the God's Eye. This is not just a story of a dragon. It is the story of an era. It is the story of how the world changed while one creature stayed the same, growing older, larger, and more weary until the weight of history finally became too much to bear. As we begin this journey, let the world around you fade away. Let the sounds of the modern day be replaced by the whistling of the wind at high altitudes and the distant, rhythmic beat of massive wings. We are going back to a time when the sky belonged to the dragons, and when the greatest of them all was a bronze-scaled queen who had seen it all. We are going to look at the scars on her hide and the fire in her heart. We are going to uncover the secrets of her long life and the legacy she left behind in the ashes of Westeros. Consider the silence that follows a dragon's flight. There is a specific kind of stillness that settles over a landscape once the shadow has passed and the heat has dissipated. That stillness is where we find ourselves tonight. We are looking back through the mists of time at a creature that was both a protector and a destroyer, a symbol of divine right and a harbinger of doom. Vhagar's story is a tragedy in the truest sense, a tale of immense power that eventually consumes everything it touches, including itself. She was the last link to the old world, the last creature to have felt the air of a time before the Iron Throne was forged. When she fell, a part of the world's magic fell with her. The Age of Dragons did not end with a whisper. It ended with the crash of her massive body into the water, a final thunderous punctuation mark on a century and a half of Targaryen supremacy. But before we reach that end, we must understand the beginning. We must understand the fire. We must understand why the name Vhagar still commands such reverence and fear in the annals of history. Why did the sight of her over a battlefield cause even the bravest kings to tremble? Was it just her size, or was it the sense that she was something more than an animal, a living piece of the Valyrian soul, transplanted into a land that could never truly contain her? As we settle into the details of her life, from her hatching in the 52nd year before the Conquest to her final breath in the 130th year after, we will see a pattern emerge, a pattern of loyalty, of loss, and of a relentless, burning destiny. The stakes were never higher than when Vhagar was in the air. A single tilt of her wings could decide the fate of a house, the survival of a city, or the outcome of a civil war. She was the ultimate prize and the ultimate curse. To ride her was to hold the power of a god, but it was also to be consumed by the shadow she cast. Her riders were among the most influential figures in Westerosi history, yet in many ways, they were all overshadowed by the beast they claimed to command. So let us begin. Let us look into the jade-green eyes of the Queen and see what she saw. Let us feel the heat of the field of fire and the cold spray of the narrow sea. We are going to walk through the corridors of Dragonstone and the halls of the Red Keep, tracking the movements of the largest dragon the world had seen since the Doom. We will piece together the fragments of Maester's records, singers' ballads, and the hushed whispers of those who survived her wrath. This is the complete lore of Vhagar, a story of bronze and green, of blood and bone, and of a fire that burned for nearly 2 centuries before it was finally extinguished. It is a journey through the heart of the Targaryen mythos, a deep dive into the soul of the dragon. As the night grows darker and the world grows quieter, let the story of Vhagar carry you away. Let the rhythmic description of her flight soothe you, and let the vastness of her history remind you that even the greatest fires eventually go out, leaving only the stars and the silence behind. We will look at how she was named, not for a person or a place, but for a deity of war, signaling from her very first breath what her purpose in this world would be. We will examine the physical changes she underwent, how her skin became like boiled leather, how her movements slowed but became more purposeful, and how her fire became so hot it could melt stone. We will explore the personalities of those who sat upon her back, comparing the icy resolve of Visenya to the tragic end of Lyghaena and the desperate ambition of Aemond. There are questions that history hasn't fully answered. What was she doing in those years of peace? Where did she sleep when she wasn't at war? How did she feel when the other dragons of the Conquest, her kin, passed away one by one, leaving her alone in a world that was becoming increasingly small? We will ponder these mysteries as we navigate the timeline of her existence. We will see her as a young, agile predator, and we will see her as an ancient, hulking titan. The story of Vhagar is the story of Westeros itself, a land forged in fire, maintained by strength, and nearly destroyed by the very power that created it. It is a tale of how glory fades, and how even the most legendary creatures are subject to the passage of time. But for tonight, time doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the journey. The only thing that matters is the dragon. So, breathe deeply, relax your shoulders, let the weight of the day lift as we ascend into the clouds. We are flying now, high above the Blackwater, high above the kings and the peasants, high above the worries of the world. We are flying with Vhagar, the greatest of her kind, the bronze shadow of the sky. The air is cold, the sun is bright, and the horizon is endless. Below us, the history of a continent is waiting to be told, one wingbeat at a time. We will start at the very beginning, in the shadows of the Dragonmont, where a small, bronze egg began to crack, releasing a creature that would one day change the world. From that tiny hatchling to the massive beast that could swallow a horse whole, the transformation of Vhagar is a testament to the enduring power of the Valyrian legacy. We will witness her first flight, her first taste of blood, and her first bond with a human soul. Through the centuries, she remained a constant, a North Star for the Targaryen family. Even when the family was divided, even when the realm was at peace, the knowledge that Vhagar existed was enough to keep the peace. She was the ultimate insurance policy, the living embodiment of the phrase, fire and blood. And yet there was a loneliness to her, a sense of being a relic in a world that was moving on. We will delve into the nuances of her various battles, not just the big ones like the Field of Fire, but the smaller, more intimate skirmishes. The way she was used to intimidate, to coerce, and to protect. We will look at the tactical advantages her size provided, and the logistical nightmares she created for those who had to house and feed her. We will see her through the eyes of her enemies, who saw her not as a magnificent creature, but as a flying apocalypse. And we will look at the bond, that strange, ethereal connection that allowed a human to direct a force of nature. We will explore the theory that dragons are more than just animals, that they are magical constructs, tied to the blood of their riders, in ways we are only beginning to understand. Vhagar's long life gives us the best possible window into this connection, as she bonded with very different types of people over her 180 years. As we move through the chapters of her life, the pacing will remain slow and steady, like the beating of her heart. We will not rush. We will take our time with every detail, every scales, every spark of fire. We will let the history wash over us like a warm tide. By the time we reach the end of her story, you will feel as though you have lived those 2 centuries alongside her. You will understand the weight of her wings and the heat of her breath. So let us begin our descent into the past. Let us find the bronze egg in the darkness. Let us witness the birth of a legend. The story of Vhagar is waiting, and the night is long. There is no need to hurry. The dragons are gone now, but their shadows remain, and tonight, we are going to walk among them. We are going to listen to the whispers of the past and the roar of the fire. We are going to find peace in the presence of the Queen of all dragons. Tonight, we explore the bronze scales that shimmered like gold in the setting sun. We explore the green eyes that saw the rise and fall of kings. We explore the fire that could turn a castle to slag and the wings that could create a storm. We explore Vhagar, the last of the Great Three, the mother of the new age, and the destroyer of the old. Welcome to the history of the fire. Welcome to the story of the shadow. Welcome to the complete lore of Vhagar. Let the journey begin, and let the rest come easy. We are moving now, back through the years, back through the smoke, back to the time when the world was young and the dragons were kings. Close your eyes and listen. Can you hear it? The sound of the wind? The crackle of the flames? The distant, heavy thud of a dragon landing on the earth. That is Vhagar. She is waiting for us in the pages of history, ready to take us on one last flight. And as we fly, the world will grow quiet, the stars will grow bright, and you will find yourself drifting into the deep, peaceful sleep of the ages. The story of Vhagar is a long one, filled with moments of intense beauty and terrifying violence, but through it all runs a thread of profound endurance. She was a survivor. She survived the doom in her lineage. She survived the Conquest. She survived the Dornish Wars, and she survived the passing of everyone she had ever known. That endurance is what we celebrate tonight, the ability to remain, to exist, and to be a witness to the unfolding of time. So let us settle in. The journey is long, but the path is clear. We are following the bronze trail of the dragon. We are going home, to Dragonstone, we are going back to the fire. And in that fire, we will find the story of Vhagar, the complete, unvarnished truth of the greatest dragon to ever grace the skies of Westeros. As the narrative unfolds, you may find your mind wandering to the high peaks of the Eyrie or the sun-drenched sands of Dorne. That's okay. Let your imagination soar with her. Vhagar's wings were large enough to carry the dreams of an entire kingdom, and they are large enough to carry you tonight. We will speak of the gold and the green, the war and the peace, the life and the death. We will speak of everything that made Vhagar what she was. From the first spark of her fire to the final splash in the God's Eye, this is her song. It is a song of fire and blood, yes, but it is also a song of the wind, the sea, and the long, slow passage of time. It is a song to fall asleep to, a song of a world that once was and will never be again. So let us begin. Tonight, we're diving into the complete lore of Vhagar. 52 years before Aegon the Conqueror first set foot on the shores of Westeros, the world was still reeling from a cataclysm so complete that even the greatest empire ever known had crumbled into ash and legend. The doom of Valyria had fallen nearly a century earlier, and on the easternmost outpost of that fallen civilization, a single egg began to stir. Dragonstone is a fortress carved from black volcanic stone, a place where the ground itself still remembers the heat of ancient fires. It was there, in the shadow of a mountain that had once been a volcano, that the last true offspring of Valyria's dragon pits broke through its shell. This was the hatching of Vhagar. The century of blood was not a peaceful time. It was an age of chaos, of shattered kingdoms and wandering sellswords, of old gods forgotten and new powers clawing for control. But on Dragonstone, the Targaryens had preserved a fragment of the world that was. They had brought with them 5 dragons from the Valyrian freehold before the doom, and among their bloodlines, new life flickered. When that bronze and greenish-blue hatchling emerged, shivering and steaming in the salt air, she carried the weight of an entire civilization. Her lineage stretched back to the ancient dragon lords, to the blood mages who bred the great winged beasts in the volcanic forges of the freehold. She was not just a dragon. She was a survivor of a species that had once darkened the skies of an empire. And now, in this lonely outpost, she would grow into something the world had never seen. Her name was chosen with care, for the Targaryens did not name their dragons lightly. They drew from the pantheon of Valyrian gods, from the named forces that had shaped their culture before the doom scattered their worshippers to the winds. Vhagar was one of those gods, a deity associated with war, with the raw and unyielding fury of battle. The name itself carries a weight that is almost impossible to translate into the common tongue. It is not merely a title, it is a claim, a prayer, a declaration that this creature was born to be the instrument of conflict. And as the centuries would prove, that name was not misplaced. To speak the name Vhagar is to invoke a shadow that stretches from the beginning of recorded time to the end of dragons themselves. Her early years were quiet, by dragon standards. The Targaryens were still a small house, clinging to their island fortress, watching the chaos of the mainland unfold. But within a generation, a rider would come to claim her, and the world would never be the same. For now, though, Vhagar was simply the last living link to the Valyrian freehold's ancient dragon stock, a creature born from eggs that had crossed the sea before the doom, nurtured by the same volcanic heat that had once created the greatest aerial force in history. She was the heir to a legacy of fire and blood, and the quiet on Dragonstone was only the prelude to a storm. As we let that thought settle, consider the vast stretch of time ahead. Vhagar would witness the rise and fall of kings, the birth of a dynasty, and the final, terrible dance that would end an age. But before we move into the chaos of the conquest and the bonds she would form, there is another chapter waiting in the wings. The next phase of her story begins with the dragon herself, awakening to her full strength and the first rider who would dare to command her. That tale is called The Bronze Queen's Awakening, and it begins in the quiet after the hatching, when the shadow of Valyria still cast its faintest outline on the earth. Rest now, and let that ancient fire warm your dreams. She emerged from the egg, not with a furious roar, but with a crackling yawn, a sound like wet leather stretching over hot stone. The shell had been the size of a war shield, dark and glossy, and when it broke, The first thing to appear was a snout, the color of tarnished bronze. This was Vhagar, the second dragon to hatch on Dragonstone during that long, weary century of blood. Her lineage ran deeper than the volcano beneath her birthplace. She was pure Valyrian stock, a survivor of the Freehold's ancient bloodlines, brought west before the Doom turned the peninsula into a smoking graveyard. Her siblings, Balerion and Meraxes, had already begun to darken the skies with their growing wings, but Vhagar was different from the very start. Where Balerion hatched with scales the color of midnight coal, and Meraxes bore a shimmering silver and gold hide that caught the sun like a jewel, Vhagar's scales were something else entirely. They were not plain bronze. They were deep bronze, the shade of old armor left in the rain for 100 years, but infused with faint greenish-blue highlights that only appeared when she turned her head a certain way. In direct sunlight, she seemed to shimmer between a dull copper and a soft, ocean-tinted verdigris. In shadow, she looked almost black, but the highlights never fully vanished. They whispered of something ancient, something from the volcanic heart of Valyria itself. As a hatchling, these colors were muted, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. But a promise is not a guarantee, and Vhagar's growth was a slow, deliberate unfolding. In her first months, she was small enough to curl around Visenya's shoulders, her bronze scales still soft as new leather, her eyes the color of fresh jade. She was not quick to take flight, where Balerion seemed born for the air, testing his wings on every gust, and Meraxes chased every bird that dared cross Dragonstone's shore. Vhagar watched. She studied. She perched on the volcanic cliffs for hours, her green eyes tracking the movements of her siblings, the ships in the harbor, the clouds rolling in from the narrow sea. This was not timidity. It was a predator's patience, the stillness of a creature that understood energy must be conserved for the moment it would be needed. As the months turned into years, Vhagar began to transform. Her scales thickened, layering into overlapping plates that caught the light in ever more complex patterns. The bronze deepened, and the greenish-blue highlights grew bolder, running in faint streaks along her neck and the leading edges of her wings. Her size increased slowly at first, then with a sudden, hungry surge. By the time she was 3 years old, she could swallow a sheep whole, and her wingspan could cast a shadow over an entire village square. Yet even as she grew, she remained the smallest of the three. Balerion was already a monster, his black hide blotting out the sun, his roar shaking the very foundations of Dragonstone. Meraxes was sleeker, faster, her silver scales a blur in the sky. Vhagar, the Bronze Queen, was compact, but there was a density to her, a solid weight that suggested she was built for endurance rather than speed. Her temperament during these early years was a study in contrasts. Against Balerion's volcanic fury, she was cool and calculating. Against Meraxes' proud, almost haughty independence, she was loyal to the point of possessiveness. She did not challenge her siblings for dominance. She didn't need to. She watched them fight, watched them hunt, and learned. When Balerion would burn an entire herd of sheep to cinders in a temper, Vhagar would wait, observe, and then take only what she needed, with surgical precision. She was not cruel, but she was patient, and patience in a dragon is far more dangerous than rage. By the time Visenya first mounted her, Vhagar had grown into a young predator of formidable power. Her bronze scales now bore the greenish-blue highlights, like moss on ancient stone, and her eyes had deepened to a dark, intelligent jade. She could fly for hours without tiring, her wings beating with a slow, steady rhythm that was almost hypnotic. And when she did strike, it was with a silence that belied her size. She would drop from the clouds like a falling star, her roar coming only after the fire had already consumed its target. This was the dragon that would one day surpass Balerion himself, growing so vast that she would become the largest living creature in Westeros. But in those early years, she was still learning, still growing, still forging the bond that would define her for a century. Her awakening was not a single moment. It was a slow, deliberate ascent from hatchling to queen, each scale a testament to the patience of a beast that knew its time would come. And that time began with a single touch, Visenya's hand on her snout, a whispered name, and a bond that would carry them both through fire and blood. But the story of that first bond is one for another chapter. The Bronze Queen had grown, her scales catching the light of Dragonstone as she stretched her wings for the first time in flight. But a dragon without a rider is only half a legend, and it was in the shadow of that same volcanic island, amidst the salt spray and the distant cries of gulls, that a young woman, with silver hair and eyes the colour of winter storms, would step forward to claim her fate. Visenya Targaryen was not like her sister Rhaenys, who laughed easily and wore poetry on her sleeves. Visenya was forged from older, sharper steel. She carried a Valyrian steel sword called Dark Sister, and her presence commanded the same respect one would give a drawn blade. She was stern, practical, and deeply attuned to the raw power that had been sleeping in the dragon eggs of her house for generations. When she first laid eyes on Vhagar, still a young dragon but already formidable, something inside her recognized a kindred spirit. This would not be a partnership of convenience. It would be a bond of fire and iron, woven in the quiet moments between roars. The claiming itself was not a spectacle. There were no grand ceremonies, no feasts in the Great Hall. Visenya walked directly into the dragon's lair, her steps measured and unafraid. The bronze dragon raised her head, green eyes narrowing as she assessed this two-legged creature who dared approach without a whip or chain. And yet, something in Visenya's steady gaze, in the calm rhythm of her breathing, spoke a language older than words. Vhagar did not recoil. She lowered her neck, and Visenya climbed onto her back, as if she had always belonged there. In that moment, a partnership was sealed that would reshape a continent. The psychological connection between the stern warrior queen and her fierce mount was unlike any other bond in Targaryen history. Where other riders might whisper commands or use sharp gestures, Visenya and Vhagar seemed to communicate through silence and shared intent. They understood each other on a level that transcended instinct. Vhagar was not a beast to be tamed. She was an ally to be respected. Visenya never struck her dragon, never raised her voice in anger. Instead, she learned to read the subtle shifts in Vhagar's body, the twitch of a wing, the flicker of a tail, and Vhagar, in turn, learned to anticipate the thoughts of her rider before they were spoken aloud. This was not domination. This was trust hardened by time, a bond forged in the crucible of shared solitude. Those early flights over the narrow sea became the foundation of everything that followed. Visenya would take Vhagar out before dawn, when the waters were still black and the stars were beginning to fade. They would climb high above the clouds, the wind roaring past them, and then dive down into the mist, skimming the waves at incredible speed. It was during these flights that Visenya began to master aerial combat. She learned how to angle Vhagar's wings to turn sharply, how to time a blast of dragonfire so it would catch a ship's sails just as the vessel tried to veer away. She practiced strikes against floating debris, honing Vhagar's ability to breathe flame at a distance, to pivot mid-flight without losing momentum. The dragon's bronze scales would gleam red in the morning sun, and the sound of her wings beating against the sea air became a familiar rhythm that Visenya carried with her even when she slept. But it was not all warfare. There were quiet moments too. Vhagar would sometimes land on the rocky shores of Dragonstone, and Visenya would sit on her neck, watching the tide come in. The dragon would lower her head, and Visenya would run a hand along the warm ridges of her snout. In those silences, they were not queen and beast, but two survivors of a world that demanded strength from everything that breathed. And as the years passed, the bond deepened. Vhagar grew larger, her scales darkening to a deeper bronze with those subtle greenish-blue highlights that seemed to shift like the sea itself. Visenya grew more confident, a reputation spreading across the narrow sea like a warning fire. The first bond had been established, and it would not be long before this partnership was called to something far greater than patrols and practice dives. A continent lay waiting, divided and ripe for change. Vhagar would soon taste the smoke of battlefields far beyond the shores of Dragonstone. But that is a story that begins with a summons, a crown, and the first call to conquest. Visenya had claimed Vhagar, and the bond between them was forged in fire and discipline. But a dragon, even one as formidable as the Bronze Queen, does not exist in isolation. The creature and its rider were part of a larger design. A design that had been forming in the mind of Visenya's brother, Aegon Targaryen, for years. Aegon had watched the Seven Kingdoms tear themselves apart from the safety of Dragonstone. He had seen the endless wars, the petty feuds, the suffering of small folk caught between the ambitions of lords, and he had come to a conclusion that would forever change the world. The decision to invade Westeros was not made in a single council meeting. It was the product of long nights spent studying maps, reading histories, and listening to the whispered tales of traders who crossed the narrow sea. Aegon understood that the power he held was unlike anything the continent had ever seen. He possessed not one, but 3 dragons, and he had a family that was bonded to them in blood and purpose. Balerion the Black Dread, the largest and most terrifying creature alive, was his own mount. Meraxes belonged to his other sister Rhaenys, and Vhagar, though the smallest of the 3, was still a dragon that could swallow a horse whole and melt steel with a single breath. Together they could burn any army, any castle, any kingdom into submission. But Aegon did not want to rule over ashes. He wanted to unite the 7 kingdoms under one crown, to bring peace through strength. And so, in the year 26 before the Common Era, he gathered his forces on the shores of Dragonstone. Visenya stood beside him, Vhagar's bronze and green scales gleaming in the salt spray. Rhaenys was there too, Meraxes coiling beside her. The 3 dragons stretched their wings, and the sound of rustling leather filled the air like a great wind. The invasion began not with a declaration of war, but with a single landing. Aegon chose the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, a wide river that emptied into the sea near what would one day become the city of King's Landing. The location was strategic, central, defensible, and near the lands of several powerful houses. As the Targaryen fleet approached the shore, the dragons circled overhead. The local lords had heard rumours, of course, whispers of a dragon lord from the east, but seeing the reality was something else entirely. The first taste of Westerosi blood at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush was not a great battle. It was a skirmish, a warning. A small force of Riverlanders and a few knights from the Crownlands attempted to drive the invaders back into the sea. They had never faced dragons. They did not understand what they were up against. Vhagar, under Visenya's command, descended low over the riverbank. Her jaws opened, and a torrent of flame poured forth, turning the grass to ash, the armour of the knights to molten ruin. Men screamed, horses bolted, and the survivors fled for their lives. It is important to understand just how overwhelming Vhagar's presence was. Even though she was the smallest of the 3 dragons at the time, Balerion cast a shadow that could cover a village, and Meraxes was not far behind. Yet Vhagar still dwarfed any known creature in Westeros. Her wingspan was 150 feet or more. Her body was thick as a castle wall, her scales like overlapping shields of bronze. When she roared, the ground trembled, and men felt their bones vibrate with fear. To stand before her was to understand, in the most visceral way, that you were in the presence of a force of nature. That small army at the Blackwater Rush learned that lesson in seconds. The initial landing was not an act of conquest in itself. It was a statement. Aegon set up a crude fortification and began to send out ravens. He called the local lords to bend the knee. Some did, others refused, and they were shown the power of the dragons. But the real test would come later, when he marched inland to face the combined might of the Reach and the Westerlands. That day, at the Field of Fire, Vhagar would burn alongside her siblings in a blaze that would be remembered for millennia. But for now, we remain here, on the mud-slick banks of the Blackwater, where the air smelled of smoke and wet earth, and where Vhagar tasted Western blood for the first time. She was still young, still learning the range of her fire, the rhythm of war, but she was already a queen in her own right, a creature of terrible beauty and purpose, and she would soon be called upon to do more than terrify a few knights. she would be asked to tear a kingdom apart. That destruction would begin in a city of stone and salt, where the Arryn fleet lay anchored, confident in its defences. Visenya would ride Vhagar into the teeth of that fleet, and the fires that followed would be the first true proof that the Targaryen conquest was not a dream. It was an inferno. The burning of Gulltown awaits, and with it, the first major city to feel the wrath of the Dragon Lords. But that is a story for the next chapter. For now, rest in the quiet between the storm clouds, knowing that Vhagar's wings are just beginning to stretch. The Blackwater rush had tasted blood, but that was only the beginning. Aegon's conquest could not be won by a single victory, no matter how decisive. The king who knelt in the Stormlands had already set a precedent, but the great houses of the east remained defiant. Among them, the Arryns of the Vale sat behind their mountains, proud and unyielding, believing that the high road and the strongholds of the Gates of the Moon would shield them from dragonfire. They were wrong, but the path to the Vale was not through the mountains. It was across the sea. It was here that Visenya Targaryen would prove that Vhagar was more than a weapon of terror. She was a surgical instrument of war, and the first demonstration of her true power at sea would come at Gulltown. The Targaryen fleet, carrying men and supplies, sailed north along the coast of the Narrow Sea. Their objective was to bring the Vale into the fold, to crack the shell of Arryn pride. But the Arryns had not been idle. Lord Ronald Arryn, a boy king in name only, had assembled a formidable navy in the port of Gulltown. Dozens of warships, galleys and longships crowded the harbour, their decks bristling with archers and their holds heavy with pitch and oil. They intended to meet the Targaryen fleet in open water and crush it before it could land a single soldier. Visenya, however, had no intention of letting the battle become a conventional engagement. She understood that the strength of a dragon was not merely in its size or its flame, but in the way that flame could rewrite the rules of war. She flew Vhagar low over the water, her bronze scales gleaming against the grey sea, and the sound of her wings was like thunder rolling across the waves. The Arryn sailors saw her coming. Some would later say that the sky turned the colour of old copper, and that the wind carried the smell of heated metal long before the fire came. But there was no time to flee. Vhagar descended upon the fleet like a storm given form, and her first breath of dragonfire turned the lead galley into a torch. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter. Vhagar moved with a cold, methodical precision that mirrored her rider's temperament. Visenya did not waste flame on empty water. She guided Vhagar from ship to ship, each pass a deliberate stroke of annihilation. The dragonfire ignited the tarred ropes, the wooden hulls, the stores of oil that the Arryns had meant to launch against the Targaryen fleet. One by one, the ships of Gulltown became floating pyres. The harbour turned into a cauldron of smoke and screaming timbers. The sailors who jumped into the water were not safe. The heat from the burning ships was so intense that it boiled the sea around them, and those who did not drown were scorched by the radiant heat alone. Vhagar's shadow passed over them again and again, until there was nothing left but wreckage and ash. The total destruction of the Arryn fleet was absolute. Not a single ship escaped to warn the other ports. The Vale's naval power was erased in a single afternoon. What made this moment so significant was not just the loss of ships. It was the demonstration of a new kind of warfare. Traditional mountain defences, the passes and fortresses that had protected the Vale for centuries, became irrelevant when the enemy could arrive by sea and burn the fleet that was supposed to guard the coast. Visenya's cold efficiency in using Vhagar to bypass those defences was a message to every lord in Westeros. Your walls are meaningless. Your fleets are kindling. There is no shelter from the dragon's shadow. And yet, even in the midst of that inferno, Visenya held Vhagar in check. She did not allow the dragon to pursue fleeing civilians or to burn the port itself. The fleet was the target. The city of Gulltown, once it saw the fate of its defenders, surrendered without a fight. This was not wanton destruction, it was strategy. Visenya understood that fear when wielded with discipline, could win a kingdom without the cost of endless bloodshed. As the sun set over the smoking harbour, the waters of the narrow sea reflected a red that was not the colour of sunset. The Targaryen fleet anchored unopposed. The Vale lay open, its pride broken, its gates waiting to be opened by a dragon's roar. But there were still pockets of resistance. Beyond the mountains, along the coast, smaller lords and knights refused to bend. One such place would soon test the limits of Visenya's patience. A fortified point of land, where the loyalty of the small folk would be measured not by their walls, but by their willingness to submit. That place was Crackclaw Point, and its fate would be decided not by steel, but by the memory of what happened at Gulltown. From the smoking ruins of Gulltown's fleet, the news of Vhagar's fury travelled faster than any raven. Along the coast, through the passes of the Mountains of the Moon, and down into the sodden lowlands of Crackclaw Point, the stories grew with each telling. Fishermen spoke of a bronze shadow that blotted out the sun, of wings that stirred the sea into a frenzy, and of a roar that could shatter stone before the flames ever touched it. By the time Visenya Targaryen turned Vhagar's head southward, the lords of Crackclaw Point had already heard the whispers, and they had begun to wonder if their oaths to the Storm King were worth the price of being turned to ash. Crackclaw Point is a region of tangled bogs, dark forests, and stubborn hills that jut into the Bay of Crabs. Its people are known for their fierce independence, their loyalty to the old ways, and their distrust of outsiders. For centuries, they had resisted the authority of the Storm Kings, paying tribute only when a strong king forced them, and rising in rebellion the moment his back was turned. But they had never faced a dragon. They had never seen a beast that could turn a stone, keep into a funeral pyre with a single breath. And they had never seen Visenya Targaryen. The queen did not come with an army. She came alone, mounted on Vhagar, and that was enough. This was not a campaign of fire and blood in the traditional sense. There would be no long sieges, no desperate charges, no rivers of spilled blood. Instead, it was a demonstration of Vhagar's psychological power as a tool of diplomacy. Visenya understood something that many conquerors forget. Fear can accomplish what steel cannot. A sword can kill one man. A dragon can kill 100. But the mere sight of a dragon can make 1,000 men lay down their arms without a single blow being struck. And so she flew. She flew low over the holdings of the Crackclaw lords, letting Vhagar's shadow pass over their fields and their villages. She circled each stronghold at a leisurely pace, close enough that the lords could see the bronze scales, the green eyes, the width of those leathery wings. She did not burn anything, not yet. She simply let them look. She let them imagine what it would feel like to watch their home dissolve in dragonfire. She let them count the cost of defiance in their own minds. And every one of them came to the same conclusion. One by one they yielded. Lord Brune, Lord Boggs, Lord Hardy, Lord Cave. The names of the Crackclaw houses read like a litany of surrender. They came to Visenya on their knees, offering their swords and their pledges. They did not ask for terms, only for mercy, and she gave it to them, because she did not need to prove anything. The threat of dragonfire had already established her authority. Visenya's personal domain, carved not through battle, but through the gravity of Vhagar's presence, now stretched from the mouth of the Blackwater to the shores of the Bay of Crabs. The lords of Crackclaw Point would remember that day for generations. They would remember the Bronze Queen in the sky and the silence that followed when she passed. But Crackclaw Point was only a prelude. The great test of Vhagar's power was yet to come, when the largest army ever assembled in Westeros would meet the 3 dragons of House Targaryen on an open field. That battle would seal the fate of the 7 kingdoms. That battle would be called the Field of Fire. From Crackclaw Point, the Targaryen host moved west. The lords of the Blackwater had bent the knee, but the true test of conquest was yet to come. Aegon the Conqueror understood that submission through fear was fragile. It had to be forged in fire, and so the 3 dragons flew together for the first and only time in history. Valyrian, the Black Dread, whose shadow could swallow a town, Meraxes, silver and swift with eyes like molten gold, and Vhagar, the Bronze Queen, still smaller than her siblings, but already formidable, her scales catching the light as if she were a living forge. They converged on the Reach, where the combined armies of King Mern, the 9th of House Gardener, and King Loren of the Rock had gathered, 4,000 men, armoured and ready, the last hope of the south. The battlefield was a plain of wheat and grass, stretching toward the Blackwater Rush. The two kings had formed a line of spears, shields and cavalry that seemed unbreakable. They had heard rumours of dragonfire, but they had never seen it, and seeing it, they could not comprehend it. The three dragons came not in a single wave, but with tactical precision. Valyrian struck from the centre, his black flame turning the golden wheat into a river of ash. Meraxes harried the flanks, her silver wings diving low to scatter the archers, and Vhagar, the youngest, was given a specific task: to flank the Iron Reach, where the heaviest knights of the Reach had massed, the flower of chivalry, encased in steel from head to toe. Vhagar came from the east, low and fast, a bronze belly skimming the smoke. The knights saw her only moments before the heat hit them. It was not a blast of fire that consumed them, but a wave of molten air. Their armour, so carefully polished for glory, became their tombs. The metal glowed red, then white, then ran like candle wax. Men screamed as their own armour boiled them alive. Vhagar did not merely burn them, she melted them into the earth. 4,000 men died that day. The Gardener dynasty ended with King Mern the 9th, who had no heir to survive the fire. The Reach, the breadbasket of Westeros, was broken, and in that moment the power of the Targaryens was no longer a rumour. It was a fact written in ash. After the fires died down, the silence was heavier than the flames. Aegon the Conqueror dismounted from Balerion and walked among the charred remains. He knew that this victory had cost the Seven Kingdoms their last hope of unified resistance. The North remained, of course, a cold and stubborn land, ruled by a king who had not yet bent the knee. But that was a matter for another day, another flight, another chapter. The Field of Fire had sealed the fate of the South, and the road to the Neck was now open. The Bronze Queen Vhagar had proven that even the smallest of the three dragons could reshape the course of history. And as the smoke cleared, a new chapter was about to begin. The kneeling of the North. The Field of Fire had ended in a single afternoon of ash and silence. The last king of the Reach, Mern the Gardener, lay dead among the charred skeletons of his own host, and the fire roses of House Gardener had been reduced to a memory. Aegon the Conqueror had watched from the back of Balerion as the flames consumed 4,000 men, while Visenya and Rhaenys flanked him on Vhagar and Meraxes. The three dragons had never flown together before that day, and they never would again. But the message was unmistakable. The Seven Kingdoms were no longer a collection of sovereign realms. They were prey, and after the Field of Fire, the prey began to scatter. The lords who had not yet bent the knee saw the smoke rising from the Reach and understood what it meant. Some sent ravens pledging fealty before Aegon could even arrive at their gates. Others fled north, hoping the distance and the snows would protect them. But one king did not flee, and he did not immediately bend. He marched. Torrhen Stark, the King of Winter, the Lord of the North, had been watching the southern conquest unfold from his seat at Winterfell. He had seen the news of the Field of Fire arrive on raven's wings, and he had heard the rumours of dragons that could melt stone and blacken the sky. But Torrhen Stark was not a man who surrendered without seeing the truth with his own eyes. He called his banners, gathered an army of 30,000 Northmen, and began the long march south along the King's Road. His destination was the Riverlands, where Aegon's host was camped near the Trident. The North had never been conquered. The Starks had held the North for 8,000 years, since the Age of Heroes. They had fought the Andals, the Ironborn, and the Wildlings. They had endured winters that lasted a generation. Torrhen Stark believed that his men could endure one more threat, but he had never seen a dragon. As the Northern army crossed the Neck, and entered the Riverlands. The scouts reported that Aegon's forces were waiting for them on the south bank of the Trident. Aegon had not advanced northward after the Field of Fire. He had allowed the Northern King to come to him. The Conqueror understood psychology as much as he understood fire. He wanted the Northern Army to see what it was marching toward. He wanted them to arrive tired and hungry and afraid, and then he wanted them to look up. The two armies met on opposite sides of the Trident on a clear autumn day. The river ran shallow and wide at that stretch, and the water was cold enough to steal the breath from a man's lungs. Torrhen Stark arranged his 30,000 Northmen along the north bank in a dense shield wall. Their banners, the grey direwolf of House Stark, the green pine of House Glover, the stone fists of House Umber, flapped in a wind that smelled of snow to come. The Northerners were armed with axes, spears and longbows. They were not the levies of the Reach or the knights of the West. They were hard men from a hard land, and they had come to fight. On the south bank, Aegon's host was smaller, perhaps 20,000, but they had 3 dragons, and one of those dragons was Vhagar. Torrhen Stark had heard descriptions of the dragons, but he had never seen one. When Vhagar lifted her head above the Targaryen camp, the sight was enough to silence the entire northern host. She was the smallest of the 3 at that time, but still large enough to swallow a horse whole. Her scales caught the afternoon sun and gleamed like ancient bronze, and her green eyes, the colour of deep forest shadows, scanned the opposite bank with a patience that seemed almost predatory. She did not roar. She did not breathe fire. She simply stood there, a living monument of fire and scale, and that was enough. The standoff lasted for 2 days. Torrhen Stark sent riders across the river under a banner of parley, seeking terms. Aegon received them in his tent, with Baelarian's shadow falling across the canvas. The terms were simple. Bend the knee and the North would keep its lords, its laws and its customs. Resist and the North would burn. The Stark riders returned with the message, and Torrhen Stark sat in his war council as his bannermen debated. Some urged him to fight. Lord Umber, a giant of a man with a voice like grinding stone, insisted that the North had never knelt to anyone, and that the dragons could not fly forever. Others, like Lord Manderley, argued that men could not fight fire, and that a peaceful submission would preserve the North for future generations. Through it all, Vhagar did not move. She remained on the south bank, occasionally shifting her weight or flicking her tail, but never once taking to the air. It was a calculated silence. Visenya, who rode her, understood that the threat of a dragon is often more powerful than the dragon itself. If Vhagar had flown across the river and begun the slaughter, the Northmen would have fought with the desperation of men, with nothing left to lose. But by staying still, by allowing the Northerners to stare at her for 2 days, she became something worse than a weapon. She became a spectre. Every soldier who looked at her saw his own death reflected in those green eyes. Every lord who argued for battle felt the weight of that gaze on his shoulders. On the second night, Torrhen Stark made his decision. He walked alone to the riverbank, wrapped in a heavy fur cloak, and he watched the Targaryen campfires flicker on the far shore. Some say he saw Vhagar's silhouette against the stars, and that in that moment he understood that his duty was not to die gloriously, but to live wisely for his people. He turned back to his tent and wrote a letter of surrender. The next morning, Torrhen Stark crossed the Trident with a small retinue of lords. He knelt before Aegon in the mud, and he swore fealty to the Targaryen dynasty. It was the first time in 8,000 years that a Stark had bent the knee to a foreign conqueror. The Northmen watched in silence from the far bank, their shields lowered, their axes sheathed. There was no war song, no battle cry, only the sound of the river flowing past. And Vhagar still did not move. She watched the ceremony from a distance, her tail curling around a red oak tree. She had been the instrument of the peace, not through destruction, but through the promise of it. In that moment, the transformation of Vhagar from a weapon of war to a symbol of the new Targaryen peace began. She was no longer merely the beast that had burned Gulltown or incinerated the Gardener host. She was the reason the king in the north had knelt. She was the shadow that had ended the last independent kingdom of Westeros. After the oaths were sworn, Aegon ordered that the northern army be allowed to return home with their weapons and their honour intact. There was no massacre, no burning of villages, no forced migration. Torrhen Stark had made the right choice. He was even given the title of Warden of the North, a role that his descendants would hold for centuries to come. But the cost of that peace was the end of the Stark kingship. The North would never again be ruled from Winterfell alone. It was now part of a larger realm, bound by dragonfire and by the oath of one man who had looked into the eyes of a bronze dragon and seen the future. The Trident standoff became a legend in the North. Bards would sing of the day the king who knelt saved his people from the flames. But for Vhagar, it was just another day in a long life. She had seen kingdoms rise and fall. She had watched men burn and weep and pray. This was not even the most dramatic moment of her existence, yet it was one of the most consequential, because by not fighting, she had ensured that the North would enter the Targaryen peace with its culture intact, its blood unshed, and its resentment kept deep underground. For a few years that peace held. The Seven Kingdoms were unified under Aegon I, and dragons flew from the wall to the summer sea. But there was one kingdom that had not bent the knee, one region that had refused to even send a delegation. Dorne, the land of red mountains and red sand, had watched the field of fire and the kneeling of the north and still chosen defiance. Aegon would soon turn his gaze southward, and Vhagar would be called upon again. But this time, the war would not be a demonstration. It would become a nightmare. The crowning of Torrhen Stark as the king who knelt marked the final peaceful submission of a great kingdom. But peace, as the Targaryens would soon discover, is a fragile thing, and the map of Westeros still held one stubborn stain: Dorne. While the North had yielded to the overwhelming logic of dragonfire, the Dornish had watched from their scorched mountains and deep red sands with something other than fear. They had watched with calculation, they had watched with pride, and they had watched with a plan. The First Dornish War did not begin with a declaration. It began with a whisper of defiance that grew into a roar of resistance. Aegon the Conqueror, having secured the allegiance of 6 of the 7 kingdoms, expected the same from Dorne. He sent emissaries, he sent terms, he sent the shadow of Vhagar, Balerion, and Meraxes across their borders. But Dorne sent back only silence, then arrows, then fire of their own, not dragonfire, but the fire of 1,000 hidden torches lit in the night along the Boneway and the Prince's Pass. And so the limits of dragon power became brutally clear for the first time. A dragon can burn a castle, a dragon can melt an army in the field, but a dragon cannot hold a mountain pass. A dragon cannot find a foe who melts into the earth like water into sand. The Dornish understood something that no other kingdom had grasped: that the terror of a flying furnace is only as effective as the enemy's willingness to stand and fight. The Dornish had no intention of standing. They would strike, vanish, strike again, and vanish once more. They would bleed the dragons drop by drop. It is easy to imagine Vhagar, the Bronze Queen, circling above the hot Dornish sky, her green eyes scanning the jagged cliffs and dry riverbeds. Below her, Visenya sat in her saddle, her hand on Dark Sister, her jaw tight. She had known war. She had burned fleets and broken strongholds. But this was something different. This was a war of shadows. Every village they burned only seemed to harden the Dornish resolve. Every tower they toppled only drove the defenders deeper into the hills. Vhagar would land, her immense weight crushing the earth, and the silence would press in. No enemy to face, no army to rout, only dust and heat and the distant laughter of ghosts. Aegon and Rhaenys joined the campaign. Rhaenys on Meraxes, the Silver Queen, her dragon scales like moonlight over the red earth. Together, the 3 dragons and their riders attempted to force Dorne into submission. They burned the Planky town. They torched the fields around Sunspear. They laid waste to the Tor and Ghost Hill, but each victory felt hollow, each fire a temporary scar on a land that seemed to thrive on defiance. Then came the tragedy of Hellholt. Hellholt was not a great city. It was a small holdfast in the deep deserts of Dorne, a place of little strategic value, but it became the site of something that would change the course of the war and the heart of Visenya forever. Rhaenys, perhaps seeking to break the stalemate with a bold stroke, flew Meraxes low over the walls of Hellholt. Some say she was scouting, some say she was taunting the defenders. What is certain is that the Dornish had prepared. They had hidden a scorpion, a massive crossbow of the kind used to bring down large beasts, behind a false wall. As Meraxes swept past, the bolt flew true. It struck the dragon in the eye, piercing through the skull, deep into the brain. Meraxes did not even have time to roar. She fell from the sky, her body crashing into the stone courtyard of Hellholt, throwing Rhaenys from her saddle. The princess was killed instantly. The Dornish, in a display of barbaric triumph, sent Aegon the burnt bones of his sister wife wrapped in the banner of the Martells. The news reached Visenya at a camp near the Greenblood. She was sharpening Dark Sister when the Raven came. She read the message in silence. Then she looked at Vhagar, who lay coiled nearby, her bronze scales gleaming in the twilight. There was no scream of rage, no outburst of grief. Visenya simply stood, walked to Vhagar and mounted her. She did not speak a single word. But Vhagar felt the shift. The dragon knew her rider's heart, and the rider's heart was now a forge of pure wrath. The war that followed is often called the Dragon's Wrath. But before that storm fully broke, there were weeks of guerrilla warfare that tested even Vhagar's legendary endurance. The Dornish did not face the dragons in open battle. They struck at supply lines. They poisoned wells. They launched arrows from caves that no dragon could enter. They learned to read the wind and the shadows. Vhagar, for all her might, could not catch 100 horsemen who scattered into a dozen canyons at the first sound of her wings. Visenya would fly for hours, her eyes burning with a cold fire, searching for any target, any sign of the enemy. But the Dornish were masters of the land. They knew every dune, every ravine, every place where a dragon's fire could be dodged or extinguished. One night, Vhagar was forced to land in the middle of a dry wash to rest. Her wings ached. Her fire had been spent on empty hills. Visenya dismounted and stood beside her dragon, listening to the wind howl across the empty desert. She knew then that dragonfire alone could not conquer Dorne. The guerrilla tactics of the Sands had revealed a truth that no Targaryen had wanted to admit. A dragon is not invincible. It is vulnerable to a well-placed bolt. It is vulnerable to exhaustion. And it is vulnerable to the will of a people who would rather die on their feet than kneel. But that knowledge did not soften Visenya's heart. It only made her more determined. She would not let Rhaenys die in vain. She would not let Meraxes become a forgotten tombstone in the Dornish waste. She would teach Dorne what true wrath looked like, and Vhagar, her faithful companion, would be the instrument of that lesson. The dragon's wrath was about to descend, and it would be a fire that Dorne would never forget. The Dornish Nightmare had only begun. When Meraxes fell at Hellholt, struck down by a scorpion bolt through the eye, the Targaryen dream of swift conquest shattered. Rhaenys was gone. The great silver dragon, second only to Balerion, lay dead in the Red Sands. And in that moment, the war changed. It ceased to be about submission. It became about vengeance. Visenya Targaryen, the elder sister, the warrior queen, had never been one to weep. Her grief took a different form. It took the form of fire, and she had Vhagar. For a decade, the dragons returned to Dorne, not as conquerors seeking surrender, but as executioners demanding blood. Aegon flew Balerion, Visenya flew Vhagar, and together they waged what the maesters would later call the Dragon's Wrath. This was no campaign of pitched battles or sieges. It was a systematic, methodical burning of every keep, every castle, every stone-walled refuge that dared to fly the sun and spear. No corner of Dorne was safe. No lord could sleep without the dread of a shadow passing overhead, the sound of vast wings stirring the night air, And then the light, the terrible orange light, blooming against the sky. Visenya and Vhagar became a single entity of destruction. The bronze dragon, still young by the standards of her kind, had already proven herself in the field of fire at Gulltown over the Riverlands. But this was different. This was not a single battle. This was a decade of fire. Day after day, week after week, season after season, Vhagar took to the air with her rider and they burned. Castle after castle fell to her flames. The Dornish had no answer. Their scorpions could bring down a dragon if the shot was lucky, but Vhagar was not Merax's. She flew lower, faster, more erratically. Visenya had learned from her sister's death. She kept Vhagar moving, always shifting, never giving the Dornish archers a clean shot. And when the flames came, they came without warning, without mercy. The psychological toll on both dragon and rider was immense. Imagine flying for 10 years, always under the hot Dornish sun, always breathing fire, always watching your own shadow stretch across villages that would soon be ash. Vhagar was not a machine. She was a living creature, capable of weariness, of frustration, of a dull, bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of roasted sheep could cure. Visenya felt it too. The maesters record that her letters from this period grew short, clipped, almost cold. She stopped writing to her son, Maegor, with the warmth of a mother. She wrote commands. She wrote reports of bodies. She wrote lists of keeps reduced to rubble. The fire had begun to consume her as well, but still Vhagar flew, and still the flames came. The dragon's wrath was not a single moment. It was a decade-long scream of rage, a slow, grinding, relentless assault that left Dorne broken, but not defeated. Every time Aegon and Visenya thought they had broken the Dornish spirit, a new lord would rise from the ashes, rebuilding in caves, in hidden valleys, in the deep red canyons where dragons could not easily reach. The war became a stalemate of fire and stone. Vhagar burned the walls, but the people survived. They hid, they waited, they rebuilt. And the dragons grew older, wearier, more bitter. By the end of that terrible decade, Vhagar had flown over every castle in Dorne. She had seen the towers of Sunspear twist and blacken. She had watched the walls of Ironwood glow like embers. She had circled the Hellholt where Meraxes had died, and Visenya had made sure that Keep burned twice, once for pride and once for memory. But no castle was safe. That was the lesson of the dragon's wrath. If you were a Dornish lord, you lived in constant fear that one day you would look up and see the bronze shape growing in the sky, and then you would hear the roar, and then everything you had built would turn to smoke. Yet the war never ended in total victory. Dorne would not kneel. The dragons could burn every stone in the principality, but they could not burn the will of its people. And so, after 10 years, the Targaryens pulled back, not because they had won, but because they were tired. Visenya was tired. Vhagar was tired. Even Balerion, the Black Dread, seemed to fly with a heaviness in his wings. The fire had burned too long, and its light had begun to dim. The aftermath of the dragon's wrath left deep scars in both rider and dragon. Visenya returned to King's Landing with a hardness that never softened. She became a figure of fear even to her own court. And Vhagar, the Bronze Queen, carried the memory of those flames forever. She would never be the same eager dragon who had soared over the field of fire. She had learned what it meant to be a weapon. She had learned the cost of endless war. As the years passed, the war with Dorne faded into an uneasy truce. Aegon the Conqueror would never see the region fully submit, but Visenya's need for vengeance eventually cooled. Not because she forgave, but because she had spent so much of herself in the flames that there was little left to burn, and so the Wogri Queen turned her attention elsewhere. She would have one more great task before her time was done, a task that would shape the future of the Iron Throne in ways no one could then foresee. That story, the story of her final act, is one we will explore when we speak of the passing of the Warrior Queen. But for now, let Vhagar rest. Let the smoke clear from the Dornish sky. Let the bronze dragon sleep, her scales still warm from a decade of fire, her eyes half closed, dreaming of a peace she had never truly known. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. The dragon's wrath had left Dorne a smouldering graveyard. For nearly a decade, Visenya and Aegon had ridden their dragons across the desert, burning every keep, every village, every crop that dared to survive. By the time the war ended, the Dornish had learned two truths. They could not be conquered by dragons, but they could be erased by them. The peace that followed was uneasy, sealed not with a surrender, but with a marriage. A Dornish princess to the Iron Throne, and yet for Visenya Targaryen, the fire never truly cooled. She had been the first to claim Vhagar, back when the she-dragon was barely larger than a horse. Her bronze scales still soft from the egg. Together, they had shaped a kingdom. Together, they had watched Meraxes fall from the sky over Hellholt, its corpse lying in the red sand like a shattered monument to mortality. Visenya had not wept, not then. She had simply climbed onto Vhagar's back and turned her grief into ash. But grief does not disappear. It settles into the bones, the way dragonfire settles into stone. And as the years passed, Visenya began to feel its weight. The twilight years of the warrior queen were not spent in quiet retirement. She remained active in the court of King Aegon I, serving as Hand of the King during his later illnesses, wielding Dark Sister with the same cold precision she had always known. But the fire that had once driven her was now tempered by something deeper, a weariness that only the oldest souls understand. She had outlived her sister wife Rhaenys by decades. She had watched her son Maegor grow into a monster of cruelty. She had seen the realm she helped forge begin to twist into something unrecognizable, and through it all, Vhagar was there, the only constant in a life of upheaval. In her final years, Visenya took to the skies more often than she took to her chambers. It became a ritual. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen over Dragonstone, she would climb the steps to the Dragonmont, where Vhagar would be waiting. The she-dragon had grown immense by then, her bronze hide now streaked with the deep green of ancient moss, her jade eyes holding a fire older than any man's memory. Visenya would mount her without a word, and together they would fly. These flights were not for conquest, they were not for war, they were for remembrance. Visenya would guide Vhagar over the Blackwater, over the ruins of the Field of Fire, over the quiet fields of the Reach, where the Gardener Kings had fallen. Sometimes she would land on a hilltop and simply sit, one hand resting on Vhagar's neck, feeling the slow rumble of the dragon's breath. She spoke to Vhagar in High Valyrian, low and hoarse, telling her of things no one else would hear, of her brother's smile when they were children, of the way Rhaenys laughed before the Dornish spear took her, of the hollow victory of a conquered realm. And Vhagar listened. The she-dragon would lower her head, her eyes half closed, the way she had always done when Visenya's voice grew soft. It was a bond forged in fire and blood, but it had become something quieter in these final years, a friendship beyond the language of men. When Visenya died, it was not in battle. She passed in her sleep on a winter night at Dragonstone, her hand still clutching Dark Sister, her face turned toward the window that looked out over the sea. The maesters recorded the cause as old age, but the servants whispered that she had simply let go, that she had chosen to follow Rhaenys into the darkness. Vhagar felt the loss before anyone else did. The dragon's roar, when it came, shook the very foundations of the castle. It was not the roar of battle or fury. It was something deeper, a sound of pure mourning, low and endless, like the wind through a canyon of bones. For 7 days and 7 nights, Vhagar refused to leave the Dragonmont. She would not eat. She would not fly. She simply sat, her great head bowed, her green eyes fixed on the path where Visenya used to walk. The dragon keepers dared not approach her. Even the other dragons on the island kept their distance, feeling the weight of her grief. When Vhagar finally rose, she did so not to hunt but to search. She flew low over Dragonstone, then across the narrow sea, her wings beating a slow, heavy rhythm. She circled the castle where Visenya had lived, the tower where she had breathed her last, the cliff where she had watched the sun set so many times. And then, as if accepting the truth, Vhagar turned northward and flew to the only place that felt like home anymore. She returned to Dragonstone, landed on the Dragonmont, and there she stayed. For nearly 30 years, Vhagar remained riderless. No one claimed her. No one dared. She was a living monument to a dead age, the last of the 3 great dragons of the Conquest, a ghost made of bronze and fire. Young princes and proud lords would occasionally approach her, hoping to bond with the legendary she-dragon, but Vhagar would simply open her eyes. Those terrible ancient jade eyes, and the would-be rider would feel the weight of centuries pressing down on them. She would not accept another. The keepers brought her sheep and oxen, and she ate, she slept. She grew larger still, her wings casting shadows that could darken an entire courtyard. But there was a silence about her, a stillness that spoke of deep patience. She was waiting, though for what, no one could say. For nearly 3 decades, Vhagar watched over Dragonstone. She saw kings come and go, saw the realm descend into faction and intrigue, saw the Targaryen dynasty grow fat on power and thin on wisdom. And through it all, she remained. The Bronze Queen, the last living link to Visenya, to Aegon, to the fire that had forged the 7 kingdoms. But she would not wait forever. The dragon's heart still burned, and there was yet another chapter to be written. One that would see her claimed by a rider who was not yet born, one that would awaken her from this long slumber and set her on a path of fury and blood. That rider would come, and when he did, the realm would remember why they had once feared the sound of her wings. But that story is for another night. For now, we leave Vhagar on the Dragonmont, her breath slow and steady, her dreams filled with the memory of a woman who spoke to her in an ancient tongue, and we turn our gaze toward the darkness that was already gathering on the horizon. The growing terror that would soon tear the Targaryen dynasty apart. The death of Visenya Targaryen marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of something else. Something far more primal and far more dangerous. For the first time in nearly a century, Vhagar was without a rider. The great bronze dragon, who had known the firm hand of a warrior queen since before the Conquest, was now left to her own devices. And in that solitude, something profound began to happen. Something that would reshape the very landscape of the Targaryen dynasty. Visenya had been Vhagar's first and only rider for over 100 years. Their bond was forged in blood and fire, tempered by countless battles and long flights across the 7 kingdoms. When that bond was broken, Vhagar did not simply become tame or docile or lost. She retreated. She withdrew from the world of men, from the stone-walled dragon pit of King's Landing, and from the watchful eyes of the dragon keepers. She went back to the place where she had hatched, the ancient volcanic island of Dragonstone, and there she made her lair among the black cliffs and the steaming vents. At first, the Targaryens paid little attention. There were other dragons to tend to, other riders to train, other ambitions to pursue. The great dragon that had once carried Visenya was now simply an old relic, a living monument to a bygone age. But monuments do not stay still, they grow, and Vhagar began to grow in a way that no one had anticipated. During her years of solitude, Vhagar's body underwent a transformation, without the constant demands of a rider, without the need to maneuver in tight formations or respond to commands. Her growth accelerated. She was no longer a war mount, trained for precision and speed. She became something larger, something slower, something infinitely more terrifying. Her wings, already massive, stretched wider than the sails of any ship in the Velaryon fleet. Her neck thickened, her jaws broadened, and the bronze scales on her belly grew so dense that they could turn aside a lance as easily as a twig. By the time the keepers dared to take measurements again, the numbers were staggering. Vhagar had surpassed Meraxes. The dragon that had once been the smallest of the 3 conquest beasts was now larger than the one that had fallen in Dawn. Some say she was even approaching Balerion in his prime. though that may have been exaggeration born of fear, but the truth was plain to see. Vhagar was the largest living dragon in the world, and there was no creature alive that could challenge her. Her reputation grew even faster than her body. Stories spread through the courts of Westeros, whispered by sailors and merchants who had glimpsed her flying over the narrow sea. They spoke of a shadow that blotted out the sun, of a roar that could shake the very foundations of a castle, of flames that could melt stone. Vhagar was no longer just a dragon. She was a legend, a living remnant of the Conquest era, a creature so ancient and so powerful that she seemed more myth than flesh. And yet she was very much real, and she was wild. The younger Targaryen princes, those born after the Conquest, grew up hearing tales of Vhagar's ferocity. They were taught to respect all dragons. But Vhagar was different. She was unpredictable. She did not tolerate intruders. A few brave, or foolish, princes attempted to approach her lair, hoping to claim the legendary beast for themselves. They never succeeded. The dragon keepers would find them cowering at the edge of the cliffs, their faces pale, their courage shattered. Vhagar did not even need to attack. The mere sight of her, the sound of her breathing, the heat of her presence, was enough to send them running. There was one prince, however, who would not be turned away, a boy with silver hair and a fire in his heart, a boy who had already faced down the Black Dread himself and lived to tell the tale. His name was Baelon, and the story of his encounter with Vhagar would become one of the most remarkable chapters in the dragon's long life. But that is a tale for another night, the tale of Baelon the Brave, and how he dared to reach out his hand and claim the untamed terror of the skies. By the time the reign of King Jaehaerys I began, Vhagar had long outgrown the shadow of her own legend. She had surpassed Meraxes in sheer bulk, her bronze scales now carrying the deep greenish-blue patina of age and countless battles. For decades after Visenya's death, she had been without a rider, left to roam Dragonstone and the surrounding skies as a living monument to the Conquest. To the small folk, she was a ghost, a terrifying relic of a time that felt almost mythical. To the Targaryens, she was an opportunity waiting to be seized, but only the boldest would dare approach her. And in the court of King Jaehaerys, there was no bolder soul than his second son, Prince Baelon. Later history would remember him as Baelon the Brave, but before he earned that title, he was simply a boy with a dragon's heart and a streak of audacity that defied reason. It was during this quiet period of the realm that Prince Baelon made his audacious claim of the Bronze Queen, a move that would not only change its destiny, but also reawaken something in Vhagar that had lain dormant for too long. You see, Vhagar had grown weary of solitude. She was not a creature designed for idleness. The fire in her lungs still burned, but without a rider to direct her fury, she had become a brooding presence, circling the volcanic peaks of Dragonstone like a storm that refused to break. Many had tried to approach her, knights, would-be dragon riders, even princes of the blood, but she had snapped at them all, her jade-green eyes holding a contempt that only age can sharpen. No one had the courage to push further, no one except Baelon. The legendary anecdote of Baelon smacking Balerian's snout is still whispered in the halls of the Red Keep. When he was just a boy of 7, young Baelon had wandered into the Dragon Pit, where the great Balerion the Black Dread lay in his final senescent years. The beast was a shadow of his former self, but still immense and terrifying. While his older brother Aemon hesitated, Baelon walked straight up to the ancient dragon and, without a moment's fear, smacked Balerion right on the snout with his open palm. The sound echoed through the pit. Everyone froze. Balerion simply blinked, snorted a puff of smoke that smelled of ash and thyme, and lowered his head. That act of raw nerve became the stuff of Targaryen legend. It proved that Baelon had no concept of fear when it came to dragons. That same audacity he carried to Vhagar. He was no longer a child when he stood before her, but the spirit was unchanged. He approached her on Dragonstone, alone, without ceremony. The old queen raised her head, her neck coiling like a serpent about to strike. But Baelon did not flinch. He reached out and touched her bronze jaw, just as he had touched Balerian's snout years before, and Vhagar, perhaps sensing the familiar fire, perhaps recognizing the scent of a rider unafraid, submit. She lowered her great head, and Baelon climbed onto her back. The bond was sealed. What followed was nothing short of a revitalization of Vhagar's spirit under a younger, more aggressive rider. For years, she had flown slow, heavy circuits over the sea, her flames reserved for hunting wild sheep or burning away the boredom of her endless days. But with Baelon, she became something else. Faster, sharper, more eager. He was not a cautious rider. He pushed her to dive at speeds that would have terrified lesser men, to wheel and pivot in tight arcs, to breathe fire at his command with precision and fury. The Bronze Queen remembered what it meant to be a weapon. She remembered the thrill of battle. During the Fourth Dornish War, that revitalization would be put to the test. But that is a story for another night, a tale of fire and salt, and the final echo of the Dornish Nightmare. For now, simply know that in Baelon, Vhagar found not just a rider, but a kindred spirit, a dragon in human form, and together they would soon remind the realm why the oldest dragons are often the most dangerous. Prince Baelon the Brave had earned his mount, but earning a dragon and truly knowing one are two very different things. Vhagar, for all her years as a relic of the Conquest, had been content to wait in the quiet of Dragonstone, watching the world shift through the slow seasons of her long life. But war does not wait for understanding. In the year 84 after the Conquest, the Dornish once again stirred, and this time they came by sea. King Jaehaerys I had kept the peace for decades, but the Lord of Sunspear, Prince Morian Martell, saw an opportunity in the aging king's reign. He gathered the largest fleet Dorne had ever assembled, near 200 ships, filled with soldiers, horses, and the bitter hope of revenge. Their target was the Stormlands, that ancient bridge between the kingdoms, and their purpose was to burn what the dragons could not protect. Morian Martell believed that Jaehaerys, old and cautious, would not risk his dragons in a naval engagement. He believed that the storms of Shipbreaker Bay would shield his fleet from the eyes of the realm. He believed many things. None of them were true. This is where Vhagar returned to the sky over the Stormlands, not as a beast of conquest, but as a shield. Baelon had been sent by his father to patrol the coast, to keep watch for any Dornish movement. For 2 weeks, he flew low over the grey cliffs, feeling the salt wind on his face and the deep rumble of Vhagar's breath beneath him. It was a cold, lonely vigil, and many nights whispered that the king had sent his son away to keep him safe from courtly intrigues. But Baelon knew better. He had felt it in his bones the moment he first mounted the Bronze Queen. She was meant for war, and war was coming. On the night of the 4th day of the 6th moon, the signal fires lit the coast. A fisherman's lookout had spotted sails on the horizon, dozens of them, moving under the cover of mist. Baelon did not hesitate. He climbed into Vhagar's saddle, and together they rose into the black sky, the stars smeared by the dragon's passing. The air above the Stormlands is always wild, full of the ghosts of storms past, but that night it was still, as if the world itself held its breath. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The swift and total annihilation of the Morian Martell fleet in a single night is one of those rare events in history where the word annihilation does not stretch the truth. Vhagar descended on those 200 ships like a falling star. Her first pass tore through the flagship, a breath-turning oak and canvas into a shower of embers that lit the sea for miles. Baelon did not waste a single flame. He had studied the currents, the wind patterns, the placement of the Dornish vessels. As they huddled together for courage, he knew that fire spreads best when it has nowhere to run. Ship by ship, the Dornish fleet burned. Soldiers leapt into the water only to find the sea itself aflame, their armour pulling them down into a cold, burning grave. Some tried to surrender, but there was no one to surrender to. Only the dragon, and the dragon did not accept flags of truce. By dawn, the waters off Storm's End were choked with charred wreckage and floating bodies. Morian Martell himself was never found, though it is said that his golden helm was later retrieved from the belly of a fish, the metal twisted as if by a giant's hand. This single night changed how the realm understood dragon riding. Before the Fourth Dornish War, riders often flew alone, relying on the sheer terror of their mounts to win the day. But Baelon and Vhagar's coordination became the gold standard for dragon riding. Not because of brute force, but because of precision. Baelon learned to read Vhagar's wing beats, the slight tilt of her head that meant she was about to turn, the way her roar changed pitch when she was about to breathe fire. He did not command her, he danced with her, and in that dance, the two became one instrument of war, so efficient that the entire campaign ended before the sun rose on the second day. The Stormlands were saved, and Dorne would not dare rearm a fleet for another generation. When Baelon returned to King's Landing, the court hailed him as a hero, but he said little of the battle. He spent the evening in the dragon pit, speaking softly to Vhagar, while the handlers scrubbed the ash from her scales. He knew that the bond forged in that night of fire would define the rest of his life, and Vhagar's. But like all things born of war, that bond would come with a price. The next saddle would not be so easily earned, and the empty space on Vhagar's back would become a quiet testament to the cost of bravery. The Bronzed Queen had barely settled back into the rhythms of peace after the Fourth Dornish War. The annihilation of the Morian Martell fleet had been brutal and absolute. A single night of fire that left the waters of the Stormlands choked with charred timbers and silence. For a brief time, Vhagar's role was clear again. She was the war dragon, the one the realm called upon when the old enemies grew bold. Prince Baelon the Brave, her rider, had proven himself once more, and the people of Westeros had seen the great she-dragon rise from her years of quiet to remind them what the Conqueror's legacy truly meant. But that peace was not meant to hold. It came suddenly, as tragedy often does in the histories of great houses. Prince Baelon Targaryen, the Hand of the King, the son of Jaehaerys, the Conciliator, the man who had once struck Balerion the Black Dread on the snout and earned the name the Brave, fell ill. It was not a wound from battle, not a dragon's fire, but something far more mundane, a sudden sickness that took him within days. The realm mourned. The court at King's Landing draped itself in black, and somewhere in the dragon yards, Vhagar felt it. The bond between rider and dragon was never merely mechanical. Those who studied the old texts believed it ran deeper than blood, deeper than the dragon-taming rituals of Valyria. When Baelon drew his last breath, Vhagar knew. The great bronze beast lifted her head, let out a roar that rattled the stones of the dragon pit, and then went still. Not the stillness of sleep, the stillness of grief. This was not the first time Vhagar had lost a rider. She had carried Visenya Targaryen through decades of conquest and rule, and when the warrior queen died, Vhagar had retreated into a long solitude, growing wild and huge on the shores of Dragonstone. Now with Baelon's passing, the pattern repeated. The dragon that had terrorized Dornish fleets and burned enemy armadas now refused to leave her lair. She ate little, she flew not at all, and the keepers of the dragon pit grew deeply uneasy. You see, Vhagar was no ordinary dragon by this time. During the reign of King Jaehaerys I, she had become the largest living dragon in the world. The skull of Meraxes, once her elder, was now smaller than Vhagar's living frame. Only the memory of Balerion the Black Dread loomed larger in the minds of men, and Balerion had been dead for decades. This meant that the realm's most powerful weapon was now riderless, and worse, she was grieving. A grieving dragon is an unpredictable dragon, and Vhagar had already proven she could level a city wall with a single pass. The councillors of King Jaehaerys, old and weary from a long reign, debated what to do. Some argued for leaving her on Dragonstone, where she could roam the volcanic wastes in peace. Others pointed out that a dragon of that size, without a rider, was a danger to the small folk who had begun to settle further inland. But the king himself remembered his father, Baelon, and his love for the great beast. He could not bear the thought of Vhagar fading into lonely madness. and so a decision was made. Vhagar would be brought to the Dragon Pit in King's Landing. It was no small task. The Dragon Pit had been built to house the Targaryen dragons, but Vhagar had grown beyond the dimensions of most of the dens inside. Workers laboured for weeks, widening a cavern, reinforcing chains, and constructing a massive gate that could seal her in at night. The dragon keepers approached her with caution, carrying dried meat and burning incense. She eyed them with those green, jade-like eyes, and for a long moment the keepers held their breath. But Vhagar, perhaps too tired or too hollow to resist, allowed herself to be led. The flight from Dragonstone to King's Landing was slow, sombre. She did not spiral or play in the thermals, as she had in her youth. She flew low over Blackwater Bay, her shadow swallowing fishing boats whole. When she landed in the pit, the entire city felt the tremor, and then came the restlessness. The Dragon Pit was no place for a creature like Vhagar. It was dark, closed, and full of the noise of the city, the clanging of smithies, the shouts of merchants, the endless hum of thousands of people living their lives. Vhagar had been born in the open sky of Dragonstone, had soared over burning fields and snow-capped mountains. She had known the freedom of the wind and the silence of the sea. Now she was caged beneath the earth, surrounded by stone and man-made echoes. At first she was quiet. She lay in the cavern they had carved for her, her bronze scales dim in the torchlight. A tail coiled around the central pillar, but as weeks turned to months, that quiet became something sharper. She began to shift. Her tail lashed against the walls, sending cracks through the mortar. She would raise her head and sniff the air, searching for a scent she could not find. Her roar, when it came, was not a signal of attack. It was a question. Where is my rider? The keepers grew afraid to enter her den. Even the bravest among them could feel the heat rolling off her body as she breathed, could see the faint glow of fire deep in her throat. She was not hostile, not actively hunting, but she was waiting. And waiting dragons, the old books said, were the most dangerous kind. It was then that the search began. King Jaehaerys knew that Vhagar needed a rider, not just any rider, but one who could command her, who could earn her trust, who could fill the empty saddle that had been Baelon's. The king sent word across the realm. Any Targaryen, any dragon-blooded of the royal line was welcome to try. Princes, princesses, bastards, cousins. All were summoned to the Dragon Pit to stand before the Bronze Queen. One by one, they came. A young prince with silver hair and a loud voice tried to approach her, but Vhagar simply turned her head away. A princess, bold and tall, walked within 10 feet of her snout, before the dragon let out a low rumble that rattled her bones and sent her retreating. The dragon keepers tried to coax her with the old methods, with blood and fire and the Valyrian words, but Vhagar would not be commanded. She had already given her loyalty to 2 riders in her long life. She was not eager to give it again. Months passed. The throne room buzzed with whispers. Some suggested that Vhagar would never be ridden again, that she had grown too old and too proud to accept a new master. Others feared that if no rider was found, the dragon would either waste away in the pit or break free and become a terror. The empty saddle, sitting cold in the royal armoury, became a symbol of the Targaryen dynasty's uncertain future. But even as the search faltered, the story was not over. Across the narrow sea, on the island of Driftmark, a young girl was growing up. She had the silver hair of old Valyria, the sharp eyes of the Driftwood throne, and a quiet patience that would one day prove more than a match for a grieving dragon. That girl's name was Lyanna Velaryon, and she had not yet met Vhagar, but their meeting was already written in the winds of fate. And when the time came, the empty saddle would find its occupant again, though not in the way anyone expected. For years after Baelon the Brave fell, the Bronze Queen sat in the shadow of the Dragon Pit, a monument to a time that had already passed. The great bronze dragon had grown restless inside those cavernous chambers, her green eyes fixed on the sky she could no longer reach. Kings came and went. The realm grew older, and Vhagar, the last of the Conqueror's dragons, waited. She was the largest living dragon in the known world. By then, her wings spanning nearly 200 feet, her scales the colour of ancient bronze touched with the deep blue-green of a stormy sea. But no rider came to claim her, not for a long time. Then a girl from Driftmark stepped forward. Her name was Lady of Valyria, daughter of the sea snake, Corlys Velaryon, and Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, the queen who never was. Laena was only 15 years old when she walked into the dragon pit, but she carried the blood of old Valyria in her veins, and she understood something that few others did. Vhagar was not a beast to be tamed with force. She was a creature of memory, of loyalty, of pain, and Laena did not come with a whip or a command. She came with patience. The keepers warned her. They told her that Vhagar had not accepted a rider since Baelon. They said she had grown wild, unpredictable, that she had snapped at handlers and refused to eat for days at a time. But Laena only nodded, stepped past them, and walked into the darkness. Vhagar's head lifted as the girl approached. The dragon's eyes glowed like emeralds in the dim light. For a long moment, the two simply regarded each other. Then Laena spoke in High Valyrian, her voice steady, her tone soft. She did not demand, she offered. And Vhagar, the great ancient beast who had burned castles and shattered fleets, lowered her head. The bond was sealed not with fire, but with a single touch. Laena placed her hand on Vhagar's snout, and the dragon let out a low rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. The keepers watched in awe as the girl climbed onto the dragon's back, and Vhagar stood, her wings spreading wide, filling the chamber with the sound of leathery membranes pulling taut. Then they rose together, out of the dragon pit, into the open sky over King's Landing, and the people below looked up and saw the old dragon flying again. But this time with a new rider, a young woman with silver gold hair streaming behind her like a banner. Lady of Valyria had claimed Vhagar, and the dragon had found a kindred spirit. The years that followed were a golden age for both of them. Laena did not remain in Westeros for long. She had the blood of the sea in her from her father, and the blood of fire from her mother, and she wanted to see the world beyond the narrow sea. So she took Vhagar east, crossed the narrow sea into the free cities, and she did not go alone. At her side was Prince Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince, the man she would later marry. Together they flew Vhagar across Essos, from the stone streets of Braavos to the red sands of Liz, from the silk markets of Myr to the ancient slave cities of the east. It was an era of exploration, of discovery, of freedom. Daemon and Laena were not bound by court politics. They were not answerable to the Iron Throne. They were dragon riders, and they had the largest dragon in the world at their command. They flew over the stepstones, watching the pirates scatter below them. They soared above the Rhoyne, following the river from its delta to its headwaters, and everywhere they went, the name Vhagar was spoken in hushed tones. In Pentos, the Magisters paid tribute to Laena just to keep her dragon from burning their orchards. She never threatened them. She didn't have to. The presence of Vhagar alone was enough. The dragon's shadow was a political statement. When Laena and Daemon landed in the fields outside the city, the entire population came out to see the Bronze Queen. Children pointed, merchants whispered. Old men who remembered the century of blood said they had never seen a dragon so large. In Volantis, Vhagar was treated almost as a religious icon. The city's ruling class, who prided themselves on their Valyrian heritage, saw the dragon as a living link to the freehold. They held feasts in Laena's honour. They offered her gifts of gold and jewels, and she accepted them gracefully. But she never stayed long. She was not interested in being a symbol. She wanted to fly, so she did. For years, Laena and Daemon and Vhagar roamed the known world. They saw the black stone of the Doom's shadow. They crossed the Dothraki Sea, a vast plain of grass that stretched beyond the horizon. They even ventured to the edges of the map, where the maps turned white and the ice began. And through it all, Vhagar grew. She grew larger, older, and more formidable. By the time Laena was 30, Vhagar had become a legend, not just for what she had done in the past, but for what she was in the present. She was the last of the Conquest dragons. She was the queen of all dragons, but even legends cannot outrun time. In the final years of her life, Laena returned to Driftmark, to High Tide, the seat of House Velaryon. She was heavy with child, and she knew the birth would be difficult. She had seen enough of the world. She wanted to bring her children into it, in the place where she had been born, and it was at high tide that tragedy struck. The labour was long. The child did not come easily, and as Laena lay in her bed, her body racked with pain, Vhagar sensed it from a mile away. The dragon roared, a sound that split the night, a sound that echoed across the water. But there was nothing Vhagar could do. She could not heal. She could not save her rider. All she could do was wait. Laena Velaryon died in the hour of the wolf, with her husband Daemon at her side, and on the cliffs outside the castle, Vhagar let out a cry that was heard all the way to Dragonstone. The Bronze Queen had lost her rider again, and this time there was no one to fill the emptiness. But the story of Vhagar does not end with Laena. It never ends quietly, because in the days that followed, a boy with one eye would come to claim her. And that would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of the Seven Kingdoms. But that is a tale for another time. For now, let the dragon rest. Let the waves wash over high tide, and let the memory of Laena Velaryon, the Lady of Driftmark, the girl who tamed the greatest dragon in the world, be a soft, gentle lullaby in the dark. Up next is Chapter 17, Tragedy at High Tide. We'll see how Daemon Targaryen copes with his loss, and how Vhagar finds her next rider, in a moment that will change everything. For years, Laena Velaryon and Daemon Targaryen had ridden the winds of Essos, their bond with Vhagar a living myth. They had flown over the ruins of old Valyria, the Bronze Queen's shadow darkening the smoking sea. They had danced at the courts of Pentos and Myr, Laena's laughter carried away by the dragon's wing beats. But time is a tide that cannot be held back, and even the happiest voyages must eventually find their shore. By the early years of King Viserys' reign, Laena had given Daemon two daughters, Baela and Rhaena, born in the Free Cities. The family had returned to Westeros, to the ancient seat of House Velaryon, Driftmark. It was there, on that windswept island of salt and stone, that the next chapter of Vhagar's story would be written, not in fire and conquest, but in blood and grief. Laena was with child again. The third pregnancy had been difficult from the start. Maesters whispered of complications, of a babe that lay wrong in the womb, of a mother growing weaker with each passing moon. Laena, ever the dragon rider's daughter, dismissed their concerns with a wave of her hand. She had faced the storms of the narrow sea. She could face this, but the flesh is not as forgiving as dragonhide, and the body does not always obey the will. The labour began on a night when the moon hung low over the gullet, casting silver ripples across the water. Driftmark's great hall, high tide, was filled with the sounds of struggle, Laena's cries, the hurried footsteps of midwives, the low murmurs of Daemon standing helpless by the door. Outside the wind howled, and far away, in the cave where she had been stabled, Vhagar stirred. Dragons feel the pain of their riders. It is a bond deeper than words, a thread of fire that runs between heart and scale. The labour dragged on for hours. The maesters tried everything: milk of the poppy, herbal draughts, even the old prayers of the sea. But the babe would not come. Laena's strength bled away into the sheets, her skin pale as the foam on a wave. Daemon, for all his ferocity, could do nothing but hold her hand and watch the light fade from her eyes. It was then, in the deepest hour of the night, that Laena made a choice. She had lived as a dragon rider. She would not die as a prisoner of her own body. With a final defiant whisper, she called for Vhagar. Daemon understood. He knew that no maester could save her now. Only the old ways of Valyria could offer a fitting end. He carried her, frail and fading, out onto the cliff that overlooked the gullet, where the wind tore at their clothes and the stars wheeled above. There Laena spoke the command. In High Valyrian, the tongue of dragon lords, she gave her final order. Vhagar, she said, her voice barely more than a breath. Dracarys, the old she-dragon who had burned armies and humbled kings, did not hesitate. She opened her jaws and let forth a single searing plume of fire. It was not a cruel blast, but a clean one, a pyre worthy of a dragon rider. Lady of Valyria, the Lady of Driftmark, the woman who had claimed the Queen of all dragons at 15, vanished in a pillar of silver and gold. Her soul was carried upward on the flame, and Vhagar's roar, deep, ancient and heartbroken, echoed across the gullet, a sound that seemed to shake the very stones of Driftmark. That roar travelled for miles. It rolled over the waves, past the fishing villages of the coast, up into the mountains of the Vale. It was a sound of mourning, but also of fury. Vhagar had lost her rider. The bond, forged over years of flight and trust, had been severed in an instant, and the dragon, now riderless, was a weapon without a hand, a storm waiting for a place to strike. The political vacuum left by Laena's death was immediate. Driftmark fell into a hushed grief, but among the lords and ladies who gathered for the funeral, whispers began to stir. Vhagar was the largest dragon in the world, the last surviving beast of Aegon's conquest. Any who could claim her would hold the balance of power in the realm. Eyes turned toward the young princes and princesses of House Targaryen and Valyrion. Aemond, Daemon's son by Laena, was already watching the Bronze Queen from the shadows. But there were others, Rhaenyra's children, Laena's own daughters, even distant cousins, each one weighing the danger and the glory. The fight for Vhagar was about to begin, and it would not be a gentle negotiation. It would be a midnight claim, made under the cover of darkness, when the only light came from dragonfire, and the only law was the will of the beast. That story, the story of the midnight claim, is for the next chapter. The silence that followed Lady Valyria's death was the heaviest thing on Driftmark. Vhagar's mournful roars had faded into a low, watchful stillness, but the dragon did not leave the island. She remained there, a mountain of bronze, of green at the edge of the sea, her great sides rising and falling with each slow breath. The funeral had drawn the royal family to high tide, and for 3 days and 3 nights, the great she-dragon had not moved from her place upon the bluffs. She was waiting, though, for what, no one could say. The children of the realm had gathered, Rhaenyra's sons from her marriage to Laenor Velaryon, Jacaerys, Lucerys and Joffrey, along with her younger children from Daemon. And there were the children of Alicent Hightower, Aegon, Helaena and Aemond. Among them all, one boy in particular could not take his eyes off the beast that rested on the cliffs. Aemond Targaryen was 10 years old. He was the second son of King Viserys, a boy caught between the shadow of his elder brother Aegon and the growing tension that already crackled between the two branches of his family. He had no dragon. That was the wound that festered in him, the quiet shame that he carried in his chest like a stone. Aegon had Sunfire, golden and proud. Helaena had Dreamfire, pale and gentle. Even Rhaenyra's sons had their hatchlings, but Aemond had nothing. He was the only one of his siblings without a dragon, and at 10 years old, that truth had begun to burn. And so, on the night after the funeral, while the castle slept and the torches burned low, Aemond Targaryen made a choice that would echo through the ages. He slipped out of his chambers in the dead of night. The corridors of High Tide were unfamiliar, but he had spent his days studying the island's layout, memorizing the path to the bluffs where Vhagar rested. The guards were sparse. Funerals invited a certain laxness, and no one expected a boy to wander into the darkness alone. He moved on silent feet, his heart hammering against his ribs, but his resolve did not waver. The wind hit him first, salt and sea, and something older, something that smelled of smoke and memory. The moon was half full, casting silver light across the beach and the rocky slope where Vhagar lay. From a distance, she had seemed immense. Up close, she was something else entirely. Aemond had seen drawings of Balerion the Black Dread in the histories, but Balerion had been dead for over a century. Vhagar was alive. She was real, and she was the largest living thing he had ever beheld. Her scales were the colour of ancient bronze, streaked with veins of greenish blue that caught the moonlight like oil on water. Her spine rose in a series of jagged ridges, each one large enough to serve as a rampart. A tail stretched out behind her, disappearing into the shadow of the cliff. And her head was the size of a horse, resting on her forelegs, her eyes closed, her breath a slow, rhythmic rumble that vibrated through the ground. Aemond knew the stories. Vhagar had been ridden by Visenya Targaryen, the warrior queen, who had helped conquer the Seven Kingdoms. She had burned the Arryn fleet at Gulltown. She had set the roofs of Castle Stokeworth aflame. She had fought at the Field of Fire and had lived to see the Dornish bow in fear. She was a weapon of legend, a creature of raw and terrible power, and she had not had a rider in weeks. But Aemond had no claim to her, no blood tie beyond the Targaryen name itself, and she was wild now, untethered from human command for the first time in years. To approach her was madness. To try and mount her was the kind of audacity that had killed men far older and far more experienced. And yet, he stepped forward. The sand crunched beneath his boots. The wind carried his scent to her nostrils. Vhagar's eye opened. It was green, that eye, a deep and ancient green like the heart of a forest, and it fixed on him with a stillness that froze the air in his lungs. Aemond did not stop. He could not stop. The desire that drove him was older than reason, older than fear. It was the hunger of a dragon lord, the blood of old Valyria rising in his veins. He spoke to her, not in the common tongue, but in High Valyrian, the language of the dragon lords. His voice cracked, barely a whisper against the roar of the surf. But he held her gaze and he did not look away. He said the words that had been spoken by Visenya, by Laena, by all those who had claimed the great dragons before him. He offered himself, and then he climbed. The scales were rough and warm beneath his hands. He found footholds where the ridges met, pulling himself up onto her back, one hand after the other, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Vhagar stirred. A low growl rippled through her body, a sound like stone grinding against stone. But she did not throw him. She did not turn her head to snap at him. She let him climb. When he reached the base of her neck, he found the saddle. It was old, worn by years of use, but still intact. He settled himself into it, his legs gripping her sides, his hands resting on the reins, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then Vhagar rose. It was not a gentle motion. It was the slow, grinding rise of a mountain deciding to move. Her wings unfolded, stretching wide, and the sound of them unfurling was like thunder rolling across the sea. Aemond held on. He did not command her. He simply held on, and she understood. She took to the air. The lurch of it nearly threw him. The wind tore at his face, and the ground fell away beneath him. And for a moment he was not a boy on a dragon, but a speck of dust caught in a hurricane. The stars spun above him. The sea gleamed below, and Vhagar climbed, higher and higher, until Driftmark was a dark shape in the distance, and the world was nothing but sky and salt, and the beating of enormous wings. He had done it. He had claimed Vhagar, but the triumph was short-lived. When Vhagar descended to the beach, the commotion had already begun. Torches were moving along the cliffs. Voices were calling. Aemond slid from the saddle, his legs unsteady, his heart still pounding. He had done it. He had a dragon now. He was no longer the boy without a fire. That was when the cousins came. Jacaerys and Lucerys Velaryon had been woken by the noise. They had seen the shadow of Vhagar against the moon, and they had known. Aemond had stolen the greatest dragon in the world, and Lucerys, who was only a year younger than Aemond, who had laughed at him for being dragonless. He was the first to confront him. The words came fast and sharp. Aemond was smug with victory. He reminded them that they were bastards, that their true father was not Laenor Velaryon, but Sir Harwin Strong. It was a cruelty born of years of whispered insults, but it landed like a blade. Lucerys struck him, and then the fight began. It was not a duel, it was a brawl. 3 boys against 1, fists and kicks and teeth in the sand. But Lucerys had a knife. Aemond did not see it coming, not until the blade found his eye. The pain was white and blinding. It was the worst thing he had ever felt. A searing fire that tore through his skull and dropped him to his knees. He screamed. The blood poured through his fingers, hot and thick, and when he pulled his hand away, the world was wrong. Half of it was gone. He was screaming and screaming, and Vhagar was roaring somewhere behind him, her voice shaking the very stones. They pulled them apart. The adults came running, Queen Alicent, Princess Rhaenyra, King Viserys himself. They found Aemond on the ground, holding his face, the socket empty and dark, and they found Lucerys standing over him, the knife still in his hand. That night, a war began. Not the war of armies and battles, not yet, but the war inside the family, the one that would tear the realm apart. Aemond lost his left eye that night on the beach of Driftmark, and in that loss, something else was born. Something cold and patient and full of fire. He would not forget. He would not forgive. And he had Vhagar. From that moment, the bond between rider and dragon was unlike any other in the history of the Dance of the Dragons. It was not a partnership of equals. It was something darker. Aemond had been broken on that beach, and Vhagar had watched. She had felt his rage through the bond, tasted his pain in the air, and she had accepted him not as a child who had claimed her, but as a creature forged in fire and blood, just as she had been. The most terrifying bond in the history of the Dance of the Dragons was formed not in joy, but in violence. Aemond became one of Vhagar's riders in that moment, but he was not her rider, he was her reflection, and together they would become the shadow that fell over the realm. But before that shadow could stretch across the kingdoms, there was something else the world needed to understand. Aemond had claimed the largest dragon in the world. Yes, but what did that truly mean? How large was she really? How did she compare to the legends that had come before? The answers to those questions would shape everything that followed, and they begin with a single astonishing fact. Vhagar, in her final years, had grown beyond anything the world had ever seen, and the next chapter of our story will look directly into that truth. The chapter we call The Largest Living Dragon. Young Aemon Targaryen stood alone in the darkness of Dragonstone. His hand pressed against the fresh wound where his left eye had been. The torchlight flickered across his face, illuminating the gap where his cousin Lucerys's blade had carved away his sight. But Aemond did not weep. He had claimed Vhagar, the largest living dragon in all the known world, and the pain of that empty socket was a price he had paid willingly. Yet even as the maesters stitched the wound, the realm felt a tremor of something far older than any feud between children. For the first time in years, the black dread of the skies had a new rider, but what many did not yet realize was how heavy that shadow had become. In the years that followed Aegon, the Conqueror's death, the great dragons of the Targaryen dynasty had been falling, one by one. Meraxes had been struck down in Dorne, her silver body shattered against the red sands, and then, after a life that spanned more than a century and a half, Balerion the Black Dread finally succumbed to the weight of his own years. It was a slow, silent end, not the roar of battle, but the quiet fading of a fire that had once burned so hot it could melt stone. The beast that had forged the Iron Throne, that had carried Aegon across the narrow sea, that had been the terror of entire kingdoms, took his last breath in a smouldering cave beneath the Dragonmont. His passing left a void that no other dragon could truly fill, except one. Vhagar had been the smallest of the 3 Conquest dragons, but she had outlasted them all, and now with Balerion gone, she ascended to a title that had not been spoken aloud in decades. The undisputed Queen of all Dragons. It was not a coronation, not a ceremony, but a simple truth of nature. There was no creature left alive that could challenge her. She was the last living link to Aegon the Conqueror, a living relic of the age when dragons ruled the sky unchallenged, and she was enormous. 170 years old, Vhagar had grown to a size that begged belief. Her scales, the deep bronze with greenish blue, highlights that had once seemed merely formidable, now covered a body that stretched nearly as long as the great sept of Baelor was tall. When she spread her wings, the sound alone, a deep, leathery thunder, could be heard for miles. Her neck was thick enough to crush a war galley, and her jaws, when opened wide, could swallow a horse whole. Not a pony, not a foal, but a fully grown destrier, armour and rider and all, in a single terrible gulp. The stories told by frightened small folk said that she could blot out the sun, and while that was an exaggeration, there was truth in the fear. When Vhagar flew overhead, the daylight dimmed, and the wind itself seemed to hold its breath. But age carries a price even for dragons. Vhagar was no longer the nimble hunter she had been in her youth. Her flights were slower, more deliberate, each beat of her wings carrying the weight of decades. The fire that once erupted from her throat in a blinding torrent now came with a deeper, more resonant roar. Like a forge that had been stoked for 100 years, she did not need to be fast. She did not need to be agile. She had become a weapon of such overwhelming power that speed was irrelevant. When Vhagar descended upon an enemy, it was not a chase. It was an inevitability. The physical toll was visible to those who knew what to look for. The way she sometimes favoured her left foreleg, the scars that crisscrossed her hide from battles long past, the slight cloudiness in one of her deep jade green eyes. She was not the dragon that Visenya had ridden into the field of fire, but she was something far more terrifying, a survivor. And survivors, especially survivors of that magnitude, carry a certain patience, a certain stillness that makes their fury all the more devastating. So when Aemond mounted her that night on Dragonstone, he was not just claiming a dragon, he was inheriting a history, a weight and a slow-burning vengeance that had been coiled in Vhagar's bones for years. The realm would soon learn what it meant to face the queen of all dragons in her twilight years, when the fire inside her burned low, but the rage burned hotter than ever, and the storm was already gathering on the horizon, waiting for its first thunderclap. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. The largest living dragon in the world now flew alone. Balerion the Black Dread had slipped from the world. In his 100th year, his bones left to rest beneath the dragon pit, a monument to a bygone age. Vhagar, older than even Balerion had been at his passing, now carried the weight of history on her bronze-green wings. She was a creature of another era, a living relic of Aegon the Conqueror's time, a weapon forged in the fires of the Century of Blood, and now she belonged to no one. The dragon pit at King's Landing housed her, but she was no longer the mount of a rider. Aemon Targaryen, the second son of Prince Daemon, and the late Laena Velaryon, had claimed her in the dead of night on Driftmark, but that claim had been a child's desperate gamble. A boy of 10 years climbing onto the back of the largest dragon in the world, risking death to prove his worth, and he had succeeded. But for years afterward, Vhagar remained largely in the pit, growing larger still, her scales deepening to a bronze so dark it seemed almost black in shadow, her green eyes gleaming with an ancient patience. The peace of the realm, however, was a fragile thing. King Viserys I Targaryen had named his daughter Rhaenyra as his heir, but his second marriage to Alicent Hightower had sown division. The Queen's faction, the Greens, and the Princess's faction. The Blacks circled each other like wolves waiting for the old king to die, and when Viserys finally breathed his last, in the 129th year after Aegon's conquest, the simmering tension erupted into open war. The dance of the dragons had begun. In that first terrible moment, the Greens moved swiftly. They crowned Aegon's son, the king's firstborn son by Alicent, and they seized control of the Red Keep, but they knew they had a problem. Rhaenyra had the larger number of dragons, or so it seemed. The Blacks commanded Syrax, Caraxes, Melis, and a host of younger beasts. The Greens had Sunfire, Dreamfire, Tessarion, and the small but fierce Vhagar's kin, but most of all they had Vhagar, and Vhagar, at nearly 170 years old, was a weapon unlike any other. She was the Greens' ultimate deterrent, a dragon so massive that no single beast could stand against her. She was the answer to any challenge. The insurance that if the Blacks tried to press their claim with Dragonfire, The Greens could answer with something far more terrible. Aemon Targaryen, now a young man of 19, rode Vhagar as his primary mount. He had grown lean and fierce, his one remaining eye burning with ambition. He had been called One Eye since that night on Driftmark, when his cousin Lucerys Velaryon had slashed his face with a knife. That scar, that loss had shaped him. He was ruthless, calculating, and utterly devoted to his brother's cause, and he understood the power he held. Vhagar was not just a dragon, she was a statement. When Aemon flew over King's Landing, the shadow of his mount darkened entire streets. The roar of Vhagar could shake the foundations of the dragon pit itself. The Greens knew that as long as Aemon sat astride Vhagar, no enemy would dare attack the capital directly. But Aemon's role was not merely defensive. He was sent forth to secure alliances through intimidation. The first target was the Riverlands, where several houses wavered in their loyalty. Aemon did not need to burn a single keep. He simply flew Vhagar over the castles of House Bracken, House Blackwood, and others, letting them see the sheer scale of the beast. He landed in their courtyards, the ground trembling under Vhagar's weight, and offered them a simple choice: bend the knee to King Aegon II, or face the fire. Most bent. Some hesitated, but the sight of Vhagar's jaws that could swallow a horse whole, was enough to convince them. The dragon's mere presence was a treaty written in ash and fear. Then came the mission to Storm's End. The Greens needed the support of Lord Boros Baratheon, the Lord of Storm's End, whose castle sat on the stormy coast of the Stormlands. Lord Boros had daughters to marry, and he was known to be prideful and easily swayed by displays of power. Aemond was chosen to deliver the king's offer, a marriage pact, a promise of lands, and the implicit threat of Vhagar. He departed from King's Landing on a grey morning, the clouds heavy with the promise of rain. Vhagar's wings stretched wide as she lifted into the sky, her great body blotting out the sun for those below. Aemond wore a black leather tunic, his eye patch stark against his pale skin. He carried a sealed letter from the small council, but he knew that the real message was the beast beneath him. The flight to Storm's End took several hours. Vhagar flew steadily, her wing beats slow and powerful, each one carrying them leagues across the countryside. The wind howled around them, but Aemond was accustomed to it. He leaned low against Vhagar's neck, feeling the heat of her breath radiating through the bronze scales. The land below changed from the green fields of the Crownlands to the rocky cliffs of the Stormlands. The sea came into view, churning and grey, and then the castle itself rose on its promontory. Storm's End, a fortress of ancient stone, its walls thick enough to withstand the storms that gave the region its name. But no wall could withstand Vhagar. Aemond descended in the courtyard, the dragon's landing shaking the very foundations of the castle. Servants fled. Guards drew their swords, then sheathed them when they saw the sigil on Aemond's cloak, the golden dragon of House Targaryen. Lord Boros came out to meet him, a broad man with a bushy beard and a wary expression. He had heard of Vhagar. He had heard of the Dance of the Dragons, and he knew that the choice he made here would determine the fate of his house. Aemond dismounted, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his sword, and delivered the king's proposal. There was no need for threats. Vhagar was the threat. She stood behind him, her head low, but her eyes fixed on the Lord, her nostrils flaring with each breath. The message was clear: refuse and the castle becomes a pyre. Lord Boros accepted. He swore his swords to King Aegon II, and he offered his daughter as a bride to Aemond. Though Aemond had little interest in the girl, he had a different purpose. While at Storm's End, he heard news that Rhaenyra had also sent an envoy, her son, Lucerys Velaryon, flying on the young dragon Arax. Lucerys was coming to Storm's End to seek the same alliance for the Blacks. Aemond's one eye widened. The boy who had taken his eye 10 years ago, the boy who had started this fire in his soul, was flying toward him, and Aemond knew exactly what he would do. The storm was breaking. The Dance of the Dragons was about to claim its first royal blood, and Vhagar, the Queen of all Dragons, the last living link to Aegon the Conqueror, was about to write her name in fire over the waters of Shipbreaker Bay. But that is a story for another night. The story of murder at Shipbreaker Bay, where the skies turned black and the sea swallowed the first of many screams. The storm had broken, but the thunder was only beginning. With the dance of the dragons now a terrible reality, the Greens held a single overwhelming advantage: Vhagar. Aemond Targaryen had spent the early days of the war flying her from keep to keep, using her immense shadow to secure oaths of fealty from lords who had wavered. The sight of that bronze and green titan descending from the clouds was enough to silence any defiance. Her wingspan blotted out the sun, and her roar could be heard miles before she ever touched the ground. But intimidation was only a prelude. The first true act of war would not come from a siege or a pitched battle. It would come from the sky, over a narrow stretch of sea called Shipbreaker Bay. King Aegon II, newly crowned in the Red Keep, needed to secure the loyalties of the great houses. The Baratheons of Storm's End were a crucial prize, and both the Greens and the Blacks had sent envoys to win their support. Rhaenyra dispatched her second son, Lucerys Velaryon, a boy of barely 14 years, to deliver her message and remind Lord Boros Baratheon of the oaths sworn to her father. Lucerys rode a young dragon named Arrax, a swift, fierce beast, but still small, barely a third of Vhagar's size. Arrax was the colour of cream and gold, with horns like polished coral. He was barely large enough to carry a rider, yet Lucerys was brave, and he flew south with the hope that words could still prevent bloodshed. Meanwhile, Aemond had also set his course for Storm's End, riding Vhagar. He arrived first, his dragons landing, shaking the very foundations of the castle. Lord Boros, a proud man fond of his own importance, hosted both princes but ultimately sided with the Greens. The decision was made before Lucerys even dismounted. The Black Prince delivered his message, but Boros refused to honour his father's oaths. Then came the confrontation that had been brewing for years. Aemond, the one-eyed prince who had lost his eye to Lucerys as a child, demanded reparation. He wanted Lucerys's eye or his life. Lord Boros, not wanting bloodshed in his hall, ordered them both to leave. But as Lucerys hurried toward the stables, Aemon followed. The storm outside was gathering, a true shipbreaker gale, black clouds rolling in from the sea. In the yard, Lucerys mounted Arrax and took to the sky, desperate to escape. Aemon did not hesitate. He climbed onto Vhagar, and the pursuit began. The sky above Storm's End was a churning grey, lashed by wind and rain. Arrax, light and quick, climbed hard, trying to outrun the massive shape that rose behind him. But Vhagar was relentless. She had been hunting before the Conqueror was born. She knew the rhythms of the storm, the thermals, the way the clouds could hide a smaller dragon. For long minutes, Lucerys thought he might escape. He guided Arrax higher, into the heart of the tempest, where the winds howled like the damned. But Vhagar was patient. She could see, she could feel every tremor in the air. The moment came when Lucerys made a fatal mistake. Whether from fear or hope, he turned Arrax to face his pursuer. Perhaps he thought he could outmaneuver Vhagar, or maybe he simply wanted to see the enemy. Arrax, young and hot-blooded, breathed a blast of flame at Vhagar's face. It was a taunt, a defiance, and it lit a primal fire in the ancient dragon. Aemond, who had been content to chase, now felt Vhagar's will surge beneath him. He shouted commands. He tried to pull her back, to remind her that he only meant to frighten the boy, to take his eye. But Vhagar had forgotten him. She was not a war machine to be aimed and fired. She was a living creature of instinct and fury, and something in that small dragon's challenge awakened the predator that had ruled the skies for 170 years. The pursuit became an attack. Vhagar lunged with a speed that belied her size. Her jaws closed around Arrax in mid-air, crushing the smaller dragon's spine. The scream that tore from Arrax was a sound that no one who heard it ever forgot. Lucerys, thrown from the saddle, fell through the storm, his body lost to the churning waves below. Aemond, still on Vhagar's back, screamed for her to stop, but she would not listen. She tore Arrax apart piece by piece, her instincts overriding the rider who had claimed her. It was not murder by design. It was murder by nature, the oldest law of the wild. When it was done, Vhagar let out a roar that shook the clouds. Then she turned, carrying a silent, horrified Aemond back toward the castle. The body of Arrax rained down in pieces onto Shipbreaker Bay, and with it, any hope for peace. The pursuit of Lucerys Velaryon and his much smaller dragon, Arrax, was over. The moment Vhagar ignored Aemond's commands, acting on her own primal instincts, had sealed the fate of the realm. The horrific aerial execution that officially ignited the flames of civil war had been carried out, and there was no undoing it. Aemond landed at Storm's End in the driving rain, his face pale, his one eye wide with the truth he could not yet fully accept. Lord Boros and his men saw the blood on Vhagar's jaws. They knew what had happened. The prince walked into the hall, and the silence that greeted him was heavier than any storm. He had wanted to frighten Lucerys. He had wanted to take an eye, to humiliate, but Vhagar had taken everything. And in doing so, she had turned a cold war into a red one. The dance of the dragons would now burn across the 7 kingdoms, and the weight of that first death would press on the shoulders of everyone who had ever loved a dragon. But what happens when a rider must live with the consequence of a mount that will not be controlled? That is a burden that will shape the next chapter. In the aftermath of Shipbreaker Bay, Aemond returns to King's Landing to face his mother, his king, and the unbearable silence a deed done by a beast he could not command. That story waits for us in Chapter 22, the weight of guilt and fire. But for now, let the rain of Shipbreaker Bay fall. Let the waves wash over the memory of Arrax, and let the embers of this murder smoulder, because the fire is just beginning. The storm at Shipbreaker Bay had passed, but its echo would never fade. In the moments after Vhagar's jaws closed around Arrax and the smaller dragon's body tumbled into the churning sea, Aemon Targaryen sat frozen in his saddle. The wind whipped his silver hair across his face, and the salt spray stung his remaining eye. He had not commanded the kill. He had shouted for Vhagar to stop, knowing that to harm Lucerys Velaryon was to light a fuse that would burn through the entire realm. But Vhagar was not a horse that could be reined in with a jerk of the hand. She was 170 years of instinct, of battle, of fire. When Arrax breathed a defiant burst of flame at her, she did not see a frightened boy on a dragon. She saw a challenge. And Vhagar had never tolerated a challenge. So she struck. And now Lucerys was gone. Arrax was gone. And Aemond was left holding the reins of a dragon that had just committed an act of war. The realization settled over him like a shroud of cold ash. He had not intended to kill his nephew. He had only wanted to frighten him, to humiliate him, to make him pay for that childhood taunt about being a bastard. But Vhagar had made the choice for him. In that instant, Aemond understood something terrible. He was no longer the rider of a dragon. He was the passenger of a weapon of mass destruction, a living engine of ruin that operated on its own savage logic. Vhagar had not been tamed by his claim on her. She had merely accepted him as a companion, a human who could point her in a direction, but once unleashed, she was beyond his control. The green scales of Vhagar's neck rose and fell with each heavy breath. She turned her massive head, her jade eyes scanning the dark waters as if searching for another target. Aemond felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He had wanted power. He had wanted to be feared. He had spent years nursing that bitter hatred for the boys who had ridiculed him, who had taken his eye, and now he had that power. But it came with a price he had never truly calculated. The weight of guilt pressed down on him, not for the boy he had lost. Lucerys had been an enemy, a symbol of Rhaenyra's claim, but for the irreparable damage to the fragile peace. War was no longer a possibility, it was an inevitability, and he was the one who had pulled the trigger. Yet as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of violet and gold, something shifted within Aemon's chest. The guilt began to harden. It crystallized into something sharper, something colder. He realized that there was no going back. The realm would see him as a kinslayer, a monster, and if he was going to be branded a monster, then he would wear that name with pride. He would become the darkness they feared. He would become the warpath itself. From that moment on, every decision he made would be filtered through the lens of survival and domination. Vhagar was not merely a mount. She was the instrument of his vengeance, the hammer that would shatter his enemies. The psychological hardening had begun. Over the following days and weeks, the news of Lucerys's death spread like wildfire through the Seven Kingdoms. Rhaenyra's grief was a storm that could be felt across the narrow sea. Prince Daemon's rage was a quiet, seething thing, and in King's Landing, Queen Alicent wept for the blood spilled between families, while her father, Otto Hightower, whispered of strategy and opportunity. But it was Aemond who felt the weight of every whispered accusation. He heard the servants murmur in the corridors. He saw the way his brother, King Aegon II, looked at him with a mixture of fear and admiration. Aemond had done what no other Green could do. He had drawn first blood, and Vhagar, for her part, seemed to sense that the leash had been loosened. She grew more restless, more eager to fly. Her roars echoed across the city of King's Landing at night, startling children and setting dogs to howling. She no longer contented herself with the dragon pit. She wanted to hunt. Aemond often flew her over the Blackwater Rush, watching the ships below shrink to toys under the shadow of her wings. He would let her roar, let her breathe gouts of flame into the empty sky, and feel the thrill of absolute power. The guilt was still there, buried deep, but it was now covered by layers of resolve. He had embraced his role as the warpath, the Prince of Fire and Blood, who would stop at nothing to secure his family's throne. But the warpath is a lonely road, and as Vhagar's presence grew more fearsome, so too did the distance between Aemond and the rest of the court. His mother could not look at him without tears in her eyes. His brother avoided him. Even Ser Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, seemed wary in his presence. Only Vhagar remained constant. She was his companion, his confidant, his engine of destruction. She no longer felt like a beast he had claimed in a desperate midnight gamble. She felt like an extension of his own soul, a shadow that would follow him into the abyss. And soon that abyss would open. The war would escalate, and Vhagar would be called upon again, not for intimidation, not for patrol, but for a full-scale confrontation that would change the course of the dance of the dragons forever. The next battle would not be a chase over stormy seas. It would be an ambush, a trap set in the ruins of a castle that had once stood proud. The next chapter in Vhagar's story is the one that would earn her a new name among the histories. The Queen of Destruction at the Battle of Rook's Rest. But for now, Aemond sat astride her neck, high above the clouds, and let the wind dry the tears he would never admit to shedding. The weight of guilt and fire had become his crown, and he would wear it until the end. The weight of that night over Shipbreaker Bay had settled into something heavier than guilt. For Aemond, the death of Lucerys was not a triumph. It was a door that could never be closed again. Vhagar, his magnificent beast, had acted beyond his command, and in doing so had drawn a line of blood that could never be erased. The realm now knew that the Greens would not hesitate, and the Blacks, grieving and furious, began to plot their retaliation in earnest. But war, once unleashed, rarely follows a clean script. Both sides scrambled for allies, for dragons, for any advantage that might tip the scales. And in that feverish scramble, a new battle was already taking shape, far from the courts of King's Landing and Dragonstone. It would be a battle of cunning and sheer brutal force. A battle that would test the very limits of dragon against dragon. The stage was the small, unassuming castle of Rook's Rest, perched on the stormy coast of the Crownlands. It was held by a lord loyal to the Blacks, but its strategic value lay in its proximity to the capital. If the Greens could take Rook's Rest, they would tighten their grip on the Blackwater Bay, cutting off a vital route for their enemies. But Rhaenyra's forces could not afford to lose it, and so a trap was set. The architect of that trap was the Greens' most cunning commander, Ser Criston Cole. But the bait, that was something far more dangerous. Criston knew that the Blacks would not let Rook's Fall go uncontested. He also knew exactly which dragon they would send. Meleys, the Red Queen, ridden by the formidable Princess Rhaenys. She was the oldest and largest dragon on the Black side, a seasoned veteran of many battles, her rider a woman of sharp mind and fierce pride. If the Blacks wanted to break the siege, Rhaenys and Meleys were their best hope, so Criston laid a snare. He marched a visible army toward Rook's Rest, but his true strength was hidden. Concealed in the nearby woods, waiting in the shadow of the trees, was Vhagar, and behind her, the young King Aegon II on his golden dragon Sunfire. The plan was simple. Let Rhaenys engage the ground forces, draw her in, and then spring the ambush. 2 dragons against 1. Superior numbers, superior size, a perfect kill. And Rhaenys, proud and swift, took the bait. She flew Meleys low over the castle walls, unleashing torrents of flame upon the besieging army. The soldiers scattered, their siege towers burning, their lines breaking. For a moment, it seemed the attack was working exactly as she intended. She did not see the great bronze shape rising from the tree line. Vhagar emerged with terrible silence, her wings beating once, twice, and then she was in the air, climbing above the clouds. Aemond was patient. He waited until Rhaenys had committed fully to her assault, until her focus was on the fires below. Then he struck. Meleys never saw the shadow until it was upon her. Vhagar came down like a mountain falling from the sky. The collision was not a battle of fang and claw. It was a crash of immense bodies, a shockwave that flattened trees and sent men fleeing in all directions. Vhagar's sheer mass was used as a physical weapon to crush her opponents. She did not need to maneuver or outfly Meleys. She simply needed to be heavier, older, and stronger, and she was. Meleys screamed, a sound of fury and pain, as Vhagar's jaws clamped onto her wing. The Red Queen twisted, trying to escape, but Vhagar held fast. And then a second dragon joined the fray. Sunfire, gold and gleaming, swooping in to rake Meleys with fire and claw. King Aegon, eager to prove himself, dove into the chaos. But in that three-way clash, nothing went according to plan. Meleys, wounded but not broken, fought with the desperation of a cornered beast. She tore free of Vhagar's grip and launched a gambit of her own. A sudden surge upward, dragging Vhagar with her, then twisting to bring her own fire directly into Sunfire's face. The golden dragon reeled, his scales blackening, his rider screaming. It was in that moment that the trap turned into a maelstrom. Vhagar, angered by the resistance, responded not with strategy but with pure, overwhelming force. She lunged at Meleys again, this time with her full weight behind her. The 2 dragons tumbled through the sky, locked in a deathly embrace. Sunfire, still burning, tried to follow but faltered, his wing torn, his body smoking. Aegon too, thrown from the saddle, crashed into the burning woods below, his bones shattered, his dragon crippled. The battle ended in a heap of broken bodies. Meleys, crushed under Vhagar's immense bulk, lay still. Rhaenys, the queen who never was gone, but the victory was not clean. Aegon too and Sunfire had sustained grievous injuries that would take months to heal. Injuries that would leave the young king broken in body and mind, a shadow of the ruler he had hoped to become. And Aemond, he landed Vhagar amidst the smoking ruins, stepping down from her saddle to survey the carnage. He had won, yes, but the cost of that victory was steep. The Greens now had no fit king, and the Blacks had a martyr. The war would only grow darker from here. In the aftermath, as the fires at Rook's Rest smouldered, and the crying of wounded men filled the air, a new shape began to loom over the Green Council. With Aegon incapacitated, someone would have to rule in his place. Someone ruthless, calculating, and willing to do whatever it took to hold the Iron Throne. That someone was already moving through the Shadows, preparing to take control of a kingdom, bleeding from both sides. And her name, once spoken, would chill the blood of every lord in Westeros. Rook's Rest was a slaughter. The sky turned to ash and roaring flame as Vhagar and Meleys collided above the burning castle. Princess Rhaenys gave everything she had, her crimson dragon tearing at Vhagar's neck and wings. But it was never going to be enough. Vhagar was older, larger, heavier. When she fell upon Melees, it was not a battle of skill but an execution by mass. The smaller dragon's spine cracked beneath Vhagar's weight, and Rhaenys burned with her mount, a final act of defiance that cost the Blacks their most experienced commander. But for Aemon Targaryen, the victory came at a price he never expected. His brother, King Aegon II, had ridden Sunfire into the fray against orders, and the result was a broken king and a dragon barely able to fly. As the smoke cleared over Rook's Rest, Aemond looked down from Vhagar's saddle and understood that the war had just been handed to him. Now he stood alone. Aegon lay bedridden, burned and shattered, his reign reduced to fever dreams and the slow drip of milk of the poppy. The Green's council squabbled in King's Landing, but there was no true king to command them. So Aemond took the title that suited him best, Protector of the Realm. It was a name that had been used before, by his own father, Daemon, during the reign of Viserys I, and by others who wished to rule without the Crown Son's weight. But Aemond ruled not from a throne room, not from a council chamber with maps and quills. He ruled from Vhagar's back. Every day he took to the sky, circling the city like a living fortress, his single eye scanning for threats real and imagined. From that height, the capital must have looked small, a toy kingdom that could be crushed in a single pass, and the realm felt it. Messengers arrived from every corner, bearing reports of Rhaenyra's gathering strength, of lords who had declared for her, of dragons stirring on Dragonstone. Aemond answered them, not with letters, but with Vhagar's roar, a sound that carried for miles and turned the words of men into dust. But ruling from a dragon's back is a lonely business. The wind never stops, and the cold bites even through leather and fur. Aemond spent hours up there, his mind churning, replaying the death of Lucerys and the choices that had led him here. He had wanted vengeance, yes, but now he had a war. He had wanted to prove himself, and now he was the most feared man in Westeros. Yet fear does not win loyalty. Fear does not hold a city together when the enemy comes, and Rhaenyra was coming. Word reached Aemond that she had taken Dragonstone's full strength, that her own dragon, Syrax, was ready for war, and that the dragons of her sons and allies were growing restless. The capital was vulnerable. The walls of King's Landing were strong, but no wall has ever held against dragonfire. Aemond knew this. He had learned it from history, from the Field of Fire, from the burning of Harrenhal itself. So he made a decision that would change the course of the war. He would abandon the capital, not flee but march. The army of the Greens would leave King's Landing, taking the fight to the Riverlands, to Harrenhal, to the very heart of the rebellion. If Rhaenyra wanted the city, she could have it. It would be a poisoned prize, a hollow shell. Aemond would take the real power, the sword, the fire, the dragon, and he would break her armies in the field. And so the march began. Thousands of men, horses, supply wagons, and siege engines rolled out of the King's Gate under the shadow of Vhagar. She flew above them, her wings stretching from horizon to horizon, her bulk blotting out the sun. The soldiers called her the Shadow of Death, and they were not wrong. Every step of that march was marked by her presence. She did not need to breathe fire to terrify. Just her silhouette against the clouds was enough to make men weep and horses rear. The Riverlands, already scarred by decades of petty wars and the cruelty of the Lannisters, now faced a new terror, a dragon that seemed to be everywhere at once. Aemond flew reconnaissance each dawn, scouting ahead, burning farms and villages that harboured black supporters. He was ruthless, yes, but also calculating. He wanted to draw out the enemy, to force them into open battle, where Vhagar could annihilate them in a single afternoon. But the Riverlands were vast, and the enemy was clever. Daemon Targaryen, his own father, was out there somewhere, riding Caraxes, the bloodworm. The two dragons had never met in combat, but the day was coming, and Harrenhal loomed ahead, a cursed ruin of black stone and twisted iron. The castle that had been melted by Balerion the Black Dread nearly 2 centuries earlier. Now it would witness another dragon's fury. Aemond took the castle without a fight. The garrison fled at the mere sight of Vhagar's silhouette growing larger on the horizon, and so the protector of the realm settled into the most haunted keep in all of Westeros. His dragon coiled in the courtyard like a bronze mountain, her green eyes reflecting the fires of the forges below. From Harrenhal, Aemond waged a campaign of terror. He flew Vhagar on raids that stretched from the Trident to the God's Eye, burning supply trains, killing lords who had declared for Rhaenyra, and leaving a trail of ash that stretched for miles. The small folk whispered that Vhagar was not a dragon at all, but a shadow-given form, a creature born from the darkness between stars. They said her fire did not just burn, it consumed the soul, and in a way, they were right. Vhagar had become something more than flesh and scale. She was the embodiment of Aemond's rage, his grief, his hunger for power. Every time she took flight, the land below her fell silent. No birds sang, no dogs barked. Even the rivers seemed to hold their breath. The Riverlands became a kingdom of fear, ruled by a single dragon and her one-eyed rider. But shadows cannot rule forever. Rhaenyra did take King's Landing, just as Aemond had expected. She sat the Iron Throne, but it was a throne built on sand. The city was starving, the treasury was empty, and the people muttered against her. Aemond knew that every day he spent in the Riverlands, every castle he burned, every lord he killed, was another nail in her coffin. The war would not be decided by who held the capital, it would be decided by who held the sky. And in the sky, there was only Vhagar. The march on Harrenhal and the abandonment of the capital was a gamble that could have destroyed the Greens. But it instead gave Aemond the freedom to fight on his own terms. He was no longer a prince bound by courtly protocol. He was a warlord, a predator, the Regent's shadow stretching across the Riverlands. And as winter deepened and the nights grew longer, that shadow only grew darker, hungrier, more inevitable. The next chapter of this war would be written in fire and blood, across the scorched fields and ruined keeps that once were home to thousands. The Riverlands had not yet known their worst day. That day was still coming, riding on wings older than any living memory, with a roar that could shake the foundations of the world itself. It would be called the Scorched Riverlands, and when it was over, even Vhagar would feel the weight of what she had done. The previous chapter ended with Aemond Targaryen perched high on Vhagar's back, ruling the realm as protector from the sky. He had marched toward Harrenhal, and in doing so, he had left the capital of King's Landing wide open for Rhaenyra. The Green Council scattered, the city motherless, and the war was no longer a courtly game of letters and oaths. It was now a war of fire and shadow, fought by a single dragon and a prince who had lost his last tether to mercy. Chapter 25. The Scorched Riverlands. From Harrenhal, Aemond did not settle into a siege. He did not wait for reinforcements or for his brother Aegon to grow strong. Instead, he unleashed Vhagar upon the Riverlands in a campaign so thorough that the land itself would never forget the name of the Bronze Queen. The Riverlands were a patchwork of towns, villages, and keeps, many of them loyal to the Blacks, to Rhaenyra and her claim. Aemond knew that their strength did not come from castles, but from the people who fed them, and from the roads that carried supplies to their armies. So he decided to starve the enemy of everything: food, shelter, and hope. Vhagar's systematic campaign of burning every settlement loyal to the Blacks was not a battle, it was a harvest of terror. Night after night, the dragon would rise from the towers of Harrenhal, her wings blotting out the stars. She would fly low over the Riverlands, her bronze belly scraping the tops of trees, and her breath would turn the world to ash. Aemond did not need to aim. Vhagar knew where to go. She could smell the smoke of cook fires from leagues away, hear the bleating of sheep, the crying of children, and she would descend. Villages that had never seen a dragon before saw one now. The thatched roofs caught fire instantly. Stone towers melted like wax. The rivers themselves seemed to boil as Vhagar's flames licked the water's surface. Aemond rode her like a god of vengeance, his single eye cold and empty. He did not give commands. He simply sat there, letting Vhagar do what she had always done best, destroy. The Greens had expected Aemon to use Vhagar as a weapon in pitched battles, as he had at Rook's Rest, but that was not what happened. Instead, the isolation of Aemon and Vhagar, as they became untethered from the Green Army, grew more pronounced with every burned village. The army of the Greens was spread thin. Criston Cole had marched east with a host, but Aemon did not wait for them. He did not coordinate. He flew alone, night after night, terrorizing the countryside in a lonely, methodical fury. The men in the Green camp began to whisper that Aemon was no longer fighting for the throne. He was fighting for himself, for revenge, for the sound of screams, and the small folk began to tell stories. The legends of the fire of the Bronze Queen that persisted for generations started in those weeks. Mothers would tell their children, "Do not light a candle after dark. Do not let the smoke rise. She will see you. She will come." The Bronze Queen, not a queen at all, but Vhagar herself, came a figure of dread, a monster with jade eyes and wings that creaked like old bones. They said she could hear a whispered prayer and turn it into an ember. They said she could smell fear and follow it to the door, and there was no escape, because the Bronze Queen did not tire. Aemon himself began to feel the weight of that isolation. He had no friend at his side, no counselor, no lover. Only Vhagar, and Vhagar did not speak. Sleep came rarely, the kind of sleep where you dream of fire. And when he woke, there was always another hamlet to burn, another line on a map to erase. The war was becoming a ritual, and Aemon was its only priest. As the Riverlands turned to blackened earth, the question began to linger in the air. What happens when the dragon has no more enemies to burn, when the last village has fallen, and the only army left to fight is your own? Aemon did not think about that. He simply kept flying, kept burning, kept waiting for something that never came. And far away, in the shadow of Harrenhal, a challenge was being prepared. One that would force Aemon to face not just an enemy, but the ghost of his own past. Up next is Chapter 26. The challenge at Harrenhal, where the fires of the Riverlands meet the stones of the cursed fortress, and a confrontation that will echo through the ages finally begins. The Riverlands had been burned black. Every village, every holdfast, every field that might have fed a black loyalist lay in ashes. Vhagar's shadow passed over the land like a slow-moving storm, and Aemon Targaryen, the one-eyed prince, watched from her saddle as the world below turned to charcoal. The Green Army had long since scattered, unable to keep pace with a dragon that never seemed to tire, never seemed to hunger for anything but destruction. And so Aemon and Vhagar became something like ghosts, untethered from strategy, from command, from any purpose beyond the simple, terrible joy of fire. But there was one place that still called to him, one fortress that had sat in the heart of the Riverlands for centuries, its twisted towers rising like the fingers of a dead god. Harrenhal, the cursed castle, the place where every lord who ever held it met a wretched end. And now it was held by Daemon Targaryen, his uncle, his rival, the man who had once been husband to Lyanna Velaryon, the woman who rode Vhagar before Aemon ever did. Daemon Targaryen had come to Harrenhal not to command armies, but to wait. He knew that sooner or later, Aemon would come. The Scorched Riverlands were a trail of breadcrumbs, leading straight to this blackened, twisted ruin. And so for 13 days, Daemon sat in the great hall of Harrenhal, watching the smoke rise from the distant fires, feeling the weight of the cursed stone around him. 13 days of silence, broken only by the crackling of torches and the distant howl of wind through the melted walls. He did not send ravens. He did not muster troops. He simply waited, knowing that the sky would bring him his answer. On the 13th day, the clouds parted. Aemon descended upon Harrenhal, not as a prince, but as a god of war. Vhagar's wings blotted out the sun, her bronze-green scales glinting like wet metal in the pale light. The ground trembled as she landed in the courtyard, crushing stone and bone beneath her weight. Aemon dismounted, his single eye fixed on the great doors of Harrenhal. He did not need to knock. The doors opened, And there stood Daemon, leaning on Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel blade that had tasted the blood of 100 enemies. The two most experienced dragon riders of the age faced each other in that cursed hall. Neither spoke for a long moment. The air between them was thick with the ghosts of every choice that had led them here. Lucerys, Rhaenys, the dead children, the burning fields. Daemon was older, his hair streaked with grey, but his eyes still held the fire of a man who had never learned to bow. Aemond was leaner, harder, his scarred face a mask of cold fury. Behind him, Vhagar breathed a low rumble that shook the stones. They exchanged words, sharp as blades, but the outcome was already written. This was not a battle of armies. This was a trial by dragonfire. Aemond turned and walked back into the courtyard. Daemon followed, his steps measured, deliberate, and then they mounted their dragons. Daemon on Caraxes, the bloodworm, and Aemond on Vhagar, the oldest and largest living dragon in the world. The sky above Harrenhal turned dark as the two beasts rose. Caraxes was lean, serpentine, his scales a vivid red that seemed to bleed into the air. Vhagar was a mountain of bronze and green, her wings casting shadows that stretched across the entire valley. They circled each other, higher and higher, climbing into the clouds, until the ground below was nothing but a memory. This was the final confrontation between the two most experienced dragon riders of the age. A dance that had been building since the first sparks of the Dance of the Dragons. Daemon, who had ridden Caraxes for decades, who had fought in the Stepstones, who had known Vhagar when she was still a young dragon, and Aemond, who had claimed Vhagar as his own, who had learned to command her fury, who had felt her ignore his commands at Shipbreaker Bay. Now in the cold air above the God's Eye Lake, they would find out which bond was stronger. Vhagar's ascent into the clouds for the last time was slow, deliberate. She climbed with the weight of 180 years on her wings, each beat carrying her higher than any other living creature could dream. And as she broke through the mist, the sun caught her scales and turned them to molten bronze. Aemond leaned forward, whispering something to her, perhaps a command, perhaps a goodbye, but Daemon was already moving. Caraxes struck like a serpent, fast and venomous, his fangs sinking into Vhagar's neck. The old dragon bellowed, a sound that shook the mountains and sent birds scattering for miles. And then the two dragons tangled, claw and flame and fury, spiraling downward toward the lake below. What happened in those final moments is the stuff of legend, and it will be explored in the next chapter, the battle above the God's Eye, where the sky itself seemed to bleed. But for now know this: Vhagar, the queen of all dragons, the last living link to Aegon the Conqueror, rose one final time into the clouds, and she never came back down. The confrontation that had been building for 13 days finally erupted above the waters of the God's Eye. Daemon Targaryen had waited in the shadow of Harrenhal, a cursed fortress that seemed to drink the light from the sky. And now Aemond had come. The younger prince rode Vhagar, the oldest and largest dragon alive, a beast whose bronze scales caught the last rays of the dying sun. Daemon rode Caraxes, the bloodworm, leaner and faster, his serpentine body coiled with tension. They circled each other high above the lake, two predators whose hatred had become a living thing between them. The first pass was not a clash of fire but a test of altitude. Aemond, arrogant and burning with the need to prove himself, drove Vhagar upward in a steep climb. Caraxes followed, his wings beating hard against the thin air. The dragons rose until the ground became a distant memory, until the cold of the upper atmosphere bit through leather and scale. This was not a battle of armies or strategy. This was a duel meant to end a war. Then Aemond made his move. He turned Vhagar's massive body into a dive, a vertical descent that would have crushed a lesser rider. Vhagar's wings folded against her flanks, and she dropped like a stone, her green eyes fixed on Caraxes below. Daemon did not flee. Instead, he drove Caraxes upward, meeting the descent head-on. The two dragons collided in a thunderclap that echoed across the Riverlands. Their claws locked, their necks intertwined, and they began to spiral downward in a death grip that neither could escape.
This was the moment that would live in legend. The locking of two dragons in a vertical death spiral, their bodies becoming a single mass of tearing claws and snapping jaws. Caraxes bit deep into Vhagar's throat, while Vhagar's teeth found Caraxes' wing. Blood rained down like summer hail. Aemond screamed commands that Vhagar could not obey. Daemon said nothing. He had already made his peace with fate. The spiral tightened. The lake below grew larger with every revolution. And then Daemon did something that no one had ever done in the history of dragon warfare. He unstrapped himself from the saddle of Caraxes. He stood on the beast's back for a single, impossible moment, and then he leaped. The air rushed past him as he crossed the gap between Caraxes and Vhagar. In his hand he held Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel blade that had once belonged to Visenya herself. He landed on Vhagar's back, directly behind Aemond. Aemond turned, his one eye wide with shock. He reached for his own sword, but Daemon was faster. The blade of Dark Sister pierced through Aemond's eye into his brain, killing him instantly. The Prince of the Greens slumped forward, dead, before his body could hit the saddle. And then Daemon, with no way to control the falling dragon, leaped again into empty air. He disappeared into the dark waters of the God's Eye, taking his vengeance and his own life in the same plunge. Without a rider, Vhagar continued her descent. Caraxes, mortally wounded but still alive, tried to pull up, but his strength failed. The two dragons, locked together in death, struck the surface of the lake with a force that sent a wave rolling across the shore. Vhagar's body hit the water and did not rise. The great bronze dragon, the last living link to Aegon the Conqueror, the queen of all dragons, had ended her 181-year life in the cold depths of the God's Eye. Caraxes followed moments later, his red scales fading beneath the ripples. The battle was over, the lake settled, and for the first time in centuries, the skies of Westeros fell silent. No roar, no wing beat, no breath of fire, just the quiet lapping of water against the shore, and the weight of a world that had lost its oldest guardian. That silence would become the defining sound of the age to come, a silence that would swallow the Targaryen dynasty whole and leave behind only stories told in firelight. The story of what happened when the dragons finally fell, and what that silence meant for the future of the Seven Kingdoms, is a tale that waits in the darkness ahead. The body of Vhagar, the great bronze dragon, did not surface with Aemond's, where Caraxes and Daemon fell into the lake together, a tangle of man and dragon that would later be found by fishermen, who pulled the bones of the prince from the shallows. Vhagar simply vanished. The water of the God's Eye is deep enough to swallow a castle, and she was heavy. Iron scales, dense muscle, a century and a half of growth, packed into a frame that had once cast a shadow over the field of fire. She did not float. She sank, and the lake sealed itself over her like a wound that heals without a scar. For years after the Dance of the Dragons, the surface of the God's Eye remained placid. The war moved on, the realm crumbled, and the Targaryen dynasty began its slow, irreversible fade. But the lake kept its secret. Occasionally, a fishing boat would snag a line on something far below, something that did not yield, and the old men of the nearby villages would mutter prayers to the Seven and row away. They knew what lay beneath. They had no desire to wake it. But the crown eventually did. When the war was over, when Rhaenyra was dead and Aegon II was dead, and Aegon III sat the Iron Throne as a boy king with no dragons left to ride, the question of Vhagar's remains became a matter of state, not sentiment, statecraft. The bones of a dragon are not merely bones, they are proof that the age of dragons ended, proof that the Targaryens were no longer gods among men. And so, years after the battle, an expedition was rowed out to the centre of the God's Eye, where the water is darkest and the wind rarely stirs. Divers, weighted with stones and breathing through leather tubes, descended into the cold green murk. They found her. She lay on her side, half buried in silt, her wings folded as though she had simply grown tired and lain down. The bronze of her scales had taken on a dull patina, the green highlights muted to shadow. One eye was still open, Or rather, the socket remained, the eye itself long gone, eaten by fish and time, but the shape of her skull, the curve of her jaw, the ridges along her spine, these were unmistakable. She was a mountain underwater. The divers spent days mapping her, quartering her like a kingdom. They measured the span of her ribs, the depth of her chest. They found the place where Carax's fangs had torn into her throat, the wound that had finally bled her dry. And they found, tangled in the bones of her wing, the shattered remains of Dark Sister, Daemon's Valyrian steel blade. It had fallen from his hand as he fell, and Vhagar had taken it into her death. The recovery of Vhagar's bones took months. They could not bring her up whole. No ship could bear that weight, so they dismantled her, piece by piece, bone by bone, hauling them to the surface with winches and pulleys. The ribs went first, each one as long as a warship. The skull, when it broke the surface, was so vast that the men on the boats fell silent. No one spoke. They simply stared. That skull had once breathed fire that could melt stone. It had carried Visenya Targaryen above the Seven Kingdoms. It had been the last living thing to see Aegon the Conqueror's face, or at least the last thing that remembered him. And now it was being dragged onto a barge like a broken piece of furniture. They brought her bones to King's Landing, where they were displayed in the throne room for a time, propped up against the walls like trophies. But they did not stay there. The small folk came to stare, and what they saw was not glory. They saw the end of something. A dragon skeleton is a terrible thing to behold when you know that no dragon will ever fly again. The bones were eventually moved to the dragon pit, laid out in the cavern where Vhagar had once roosted. But the pit was cold now, empty of fire, and the bones gathered dust. They became a curiosity, a relic, a monument to what had been lost. And that is the heart of it. Vhagar was the last living link to the age of Aegon the Conqueror. She was hatched on Dragonstone in the shadow of the Doom, in a time when Valyria was still a memory and the Targaryens were still building their power. She had flown beside Balerion and Meraxes, had seen the field of fire, had burned the fleets of Gulltown and the towers of Stokeworth. She had been ridden by Visenya, the warrior queen, who forged the Iron Throne with her brother. She had known Lynna Velaryon, the sea snake's daughter who loved the wind, and she had known Aemond, the one-eyed prince, whose pride had driven him to the bottom of a lake. Every generation of Targaryens had looked up and seen Varg's silhouette against the sky. When she died, that thread snapped. The finality of her death marked the true beginning of the end for the Targaryen dynasty. Not the death of Rhaenyra, not the death of Aegon II, not the signing of any treaty. It was the silence that followed Vhagar's fall, the silence where her roar used to be. Without dragons, the Targaryens were just a family with strange hair and a crown that no longer felt inevitable. The small folk began to whisper that the gods had abandoned them. The lords began to test their power, and the dragons themselves, the few that survived the war, grew sickly and small, laying eggs that never hatched. The last dragon died in the reign of Aegon III, a pitiful creature no larger than a dog, but that was just the end of a slow death. The real death, the one that broke the spell, happened over the god's eye when Vhagar sank. Think of it this way. Every Targaryen who ever lived from Aegon the Conqueror to the last rider knew in their bones that they were different. They were blood of the dragon. And that blood was real because the dragons were real. They could see them, touch them, ride them. The dragons were proof. And Vhagar, the longest lived of them all, was the living, breathing, fire-belching proof that the Targaryen myth was true. When she went into the lake, the proof went with her. What remained was just history, and history can be rewritten. So when you imagine that day, years later, when the divers found her bones, do not picture a triumphant recovery. Picture the silence. Picture the ropes groaning as they pulled the skull from the water, water streaming from the empty eye sockets. Picture the men who had grown up hearing stories of Vhagar's wrath, and now seeing her reduced to something that could be carried away in pieces. That was the moment the realm understood that the age of dragons was not just over, it was gone. and it was never coming back. The bones of Vhagar still rest somewhere, perhaps in the crypts beneath the Red Keep, perhaps scattered to the winds of time. No one knows for certain. But the Lake of the God's Eye remembers. The water is still dark, still deep, and on some nights, when the wind blows across the surface just right, the fishermen say you can hear a sound like the echo of a roar, far below, fading. A dragon's last breath, held in the water for all these centuries, waiting for someone to listen. But no one listens anymore. The silence has won. And with that silence, the Targaryen dynasty began its long, slow drift into the past. A memory of fire and blood, with only the bones to prove it ever happened. What did you think of this journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this changed your perspective, or taught you something new, consider subscribing for more mind-expanding content. And if you know someone who would find this as fascinating as you did, share it with them. These are the kind of conversations that matter.